Right, this is going to be another episode of Thorin and Loco versus Worlds, and this is going to be the European region that we're discussing now. Hence, we have our man Deficio here, long-time European analyst, commentator, briefly pro player, so
True.
fits with the theme of the show, I guess. You're in good company with Loco here.
Yep.
Right, what about this then? So Deficio, people know you from the LCS era, from Season 3, but obviously there was the Season 2 Worlds, there was the Season 1 Championship, and despite the fact I sort of memed on chat about the fact that, it wasn't a World Championship, when we're talking about the European episode, it was a very significant tournament that was really important and
that was the only
needs
real
to
World
be outlined.
Championships.
Yes. So, although here's the thing, Jack did make a good point as a joke, which is that if people are going to keep counting Season 1 Worlds as real, then NA technically gets a semi-final. So people haven't thought that one through, actually. We might not have thought that. That might be worth the trade-off to just never give them the semi-final,
It is true. It is still kind of sad that even without any Korean teams, NA could still not get past the semi-final. And not even actually make a final.
Okay, you've spun it around again. That's good.
No,
We'll stick with
I'm just
that.
saying, I feel that's kind of sad.
Yeah, no, I like the counter spin. That's good. You sort of up the ante there, right? Here's the thing. So in the Jet episode, we touched briefly on Season 1 because actually for the NA region it is significant because obviously that's when they were the best and then the other regions got introduced and they moved along. But for Europe, it's quite an interesting scenario because while, yes, obviously Season 1 when you get to the World Championship is quite significant for Europe, there wasn't as much cross-regional play before then. Europe was more contained within Europe itself. So how would you describe the early days of the European scene from your memory?
So I started playing League of Legends at least half a year before the Season 1 patch was kind of announced. So I got to level up pre-season, back when WCG was a thing in 2010, and we sent SK Gaming there with the German lineup, and they lost to Kobe. Back then, it was obviously all just pre-mates you were playing. There wasn't the full solo queue yet, and the whole kind of high elo scene was kind of dominated by mainly a French team, or at least a bunch of French players. There's a name that I will never forget because I was a huge fanboy back then, and some really hardcore people will remember it. It was Althor, and he was the highest ranked player, or at least people thought he was because you couldn't fully see the MMR.
Sure.
But he was considered kind of the highest ranked player in all of Europe, and he played with names like Linak, the French jungler that obviously was on AAA in Season 1.
Yes.
And they kind of ran around. Yeah, then he got banned. But they ran around with this pre-made and they just wrecked everyone 24/7. I'm sure Source was involved one way or the other as well with the French guys. And then they were kind of fighting against a German team led by a jungler called Sleazy Weezy back then as well, which is a very old school name.
I remember that one at least.
Yeah, that was again one of the names that people from very early days will remember who sadly then disappeared. But I don't feel like too many things happened in Europe. Back then, pre-Season 1, it was just a bunch of different national teams kind of fighting each other left and right. But when the Season 1 patch hit, and my biggest fanboy moment started was just when the patch got released and everyone had to play the placements to start getting into ranked. In my first ranked placement game, I had Althor on my team. And I got to play bot lane with him in Kale Cillian, a classic bot lane at the time. Hard fed in the lane, got super flamed, but still managed to win. And that was the last time I saw him be relevant. It was in my first game of ranked because he completely disappeared.
Okay. You gave him the kiss of death.
I probably did. I pulled him down with me. Because Season 1 is when people think back to Season 1, it was kind of the start of Fnatic, obviously, where you had the famous lineup with Xpeke and Shushe kind of playing this double mage setup that very few teams could actually play because they just had two really mechanically gifted players. They obviously had Cyanide in the jungle, even back then when he was 14, 15 years old. And the bot lane, which I think a lot of fans probably don't remember or maybe never heard about, was called Lamia and Melisande. And they were definitely not the most hyped, outspoken players. It was all about, Shushe and Xpeke as kind of the big names and the big stars. And then you had kind of the big rival at the time as well, which was AAA. And both teams famously made the Season 1 World Championships. We already talked about NA not making the final. And the AAA lineup was where we had Source playing.
And Yellow Star?
Yellow Star AD,
Yellow Star. Yellow Star was AD carry. Kuja was support. MoMA actually was the mid laner, which was back then considered one of the best mid laners in Europe and probably in the world as well. And he was a pretty boy. Like, the guy would show up in the fanciest outfits, look super insane, like just fantastic. And
which, by the way, for anyone who's thinking, what's the big deal there? You know, people have money. Go back and watch that famous picture I always reference of Epic Gamer when they go to the Season 1 Championship where they have double lift with a bowl cut and Dyrus is like wearing all ski gear. Like, you have to understand, in this era, if you actually had a suit on or whatever, I bet you look baller as fuck, you know. People were all nerds back then.
It was insane. Like, the whole Season 1 was just you went to LAN parties. Like, that's all it was.
Which is why where the Season 1 Championship was. It was just at DreamHack. People don't realise. Like, I went to that tournament for CS, and there was a whole bunch. Like, all these other games had them as well. You know, like, I don't know, Arena. Well, not Arena of Valor. There was another game like Aeon of something. It was like all these different games that were like Dota clones, they were called, you know, and each one of them had like a little booth area. And then that's one of the reasons I always say, like, come on, man, that wasn't a world championship. It was like just one booth or something, you know.
It was in like the corner of DreamHack, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. Freak's Basement.
Freak's Basement. I think they lined up like maybe 100 seats or something for the crowd in total for the final itself.
Sure.
But then, because I remember watching that from home because I was too bad to qualify, and just seeing like the stream numbers just kept going up and up and up, and we had Joe Miller casting, I believe, with D-Man in the final as well, and the whole thing just ended up being insane because we had some, you know, AP Gragas moments with Shushay.
Brand.
We had his brand. We had his AP Alistar that obviously got hard nerfed also after the tournament. We had his cosplay. If people remember, Shushay just standing without his shirt on with like a water bottle under his arm, and that was his Gragas cosplay. And like, it's all over when you look at the pictures from the Season 1 World Champs. But obviously Fnatic managed to win, and it was also the tournament where Peke didn't play day one of the tournament because he missed his flight or something from Madrid. And We Will Failer, who happened to randomly be at the tournament as a spectator, got then subbed in, because back then you could just, you know, this guy, he's Hailu from the crowd.
He's on our team, don't worry.
We have the paperwork, don't worry. Yeah. He ended up having to play top lane. Hard fed, obviously, in the games, but I think they went 1-1 or something. And then Peke returned for the next day, and they just kind of stomped everyone. But yeah, that's how you win the Season 1 World Championship, and probably why a lot of people don't always consider it the most legit thing. But Fnatic, they were innovators already back then. I like
Sure.
That.
Right, Loco, since obviously we mentioned you were in NA for the TSM period, which was just before this, was there, I know there was like, for example, some of the Koreans, for example, would play on the NA ladder before the Korean server existed. Was there much cross-play between Europe and North America around this time?
I remember some European players playing, and Chaox and other people that lived in New York played on European servers a little bit, and like they brought over like little bits. Like Chaox would be like, guys, like EU bot lane like really good, because he would play in Europe and he would like play versus European pros, and he would come back and like try to show us. We were like, what are you talking about? This European bot lane thing? It's Garbo, like double bruisers all the way. And then we got to Worlds and we got wrecked. But I do remember a lot of the Fnatic team, because they went to OGN with that roster. So like with Peke, with Shushay, and yeah, they were a lively bunch, and they drank a lot and they partied a lot. Like,
oh yes,
that's what I remember them for.
That wasn't just Season 1. I can definitely say that wasn't just Season 1 for Fnatic. But I'm always kind of sad when I think back with Shushay especially, because I feel like Shushay was one of the first real superstars we had in Europe. Because a lot of European fans back then, they would be watching North American streamers. Like it was all about Hotshot, Big Fat GG, and so on. TSM and CLG rivalry that got built up, and there was very few European streamers back in the day to follow. Froggen wasn't a thing, as an example. Like that name didn't really exist at this point. So when Shushay at Worlds kind of showcased all these different AP builds that he was like, he'd figured out the 1.0 AP ratio on the Alistar and the Gragas, and he was just like abusing it when other people didn't do it. it just made him a superstar, and then he was a super fun character. But sadly, if I just briefly move on to season 2, the story of Shushay kind of ends in a pretty boring way. He ended up performing really poorly. He couldn't adapt when he had to try and play top lane because Pekka became the mid laner. And Shushay was kind of like trying to play things like Warwick top and so on, and it was just never as successful for him. And he obviously got replaced by Soas during season 2, and he did return briefly from Dragonborns. Some people will remember that name in 2013. They have the second longest losing streak of all time in the European LCS, and that was his organization. One split, got relegated, he disappeared.
Yeah.
So
let's not talk about that.
Lost superstar.
Yes.
EU has a lot of those.
Of course, yeah. So as you say there, one of the storylines of season 2 was Fnatic falling out of relevance and then eventually not actually managing to qualify for the World Championship. Because as I've referenced on the other shows, in season 2, before LCS, this was when we had the circuit, and then it led into a regional. So the regional for Europe obviously was famously held at Gamescom. And the 3 teams we had for Europe in season 2 was we had Moscow 5, so the best team perhaps in the world at one point in time. We can talk about that in a second. We had CLG.EU, obviously another global powerhouse, had just played in the Origen final. Both very strong teams. And then the third team, actually in this particular scenario, ended up obviously being SK Gaming, because they famously were able to beat CLG.EU in the semi-final there with that epic game with Aranea playing with them and Ocelot. And it was very much like that. Quite one of the better, more famous lineups that they had at the time. So let's just start with like season 2. As I referenced there, one of the interesting things to Deficio is that basically, because initially you just only had interplay between Europe and North America, so you had some North Americans came over, for example, for the IEM tournaments. Some European teams went to the MLGs and the IPLs, CLG.EU did, and OSK went to a couple, Fnatic early on, but famously Moscow 5 stayed in Europe and TSM stayed in North America, and then during a certain point in time, they both just won pretty much all the tournaments, almost, there was obviously the CLG.EU famous upset at DreamHack, but you had these 2 teams separately, and so at the time, even though we'd had the one IEM where WE had beaten CLG, Korea and China weren't relevant. They sort of came online as season 2 went on, because they had again their own region, and as you referenced, Loco showed some teams from the West also went over there and played in the Origen seasons. But as a result, I think the interesting thing for me about season 2 is you couldn't really do like a world power ranking type scenario, because there weren't really many matches. Like for example, it'd be very hard to know, was Moscow 5 number 1, or should you give it to the Korean team?
So from a Korean perspective, we respected the hell out of CLG Europe and Moscow 5. I remember being on MIG, Moscow 5, what is it? Diamond Procs running Shyvana jungle and like counter jungling with like lane priority. We're like, holy shit, this is revolutionary. Like, you can play jungle like this. Like, you just power farm, you invade enemy jungle, you take away their stuff, you just get dragon over and over again. Like, this team's a genius. Like, and then Gosu Pepper, like starting very he ran very tanky runes on support. So a lot of people used to run greedy runes, but he ran very tanky runes, bought a lot of wars. Like, he revolutionized how support role was played. I remember like watching with Mad Life and then like pulling Cloud Templar over and being like, this is how you should be jungling, and then being like, this is how you should be supporting. And we looked at them as the number 1 team, and we looked at them as the team to beat. And we also had a lot of respect for CLG Europe too. Any NA or European teams that came to OGN, we smacked them. Like, we smashed everyone that came to scrim us. Like, they were jet lagged, they didn't like our food, and they were just worse than us. So we smashed any team that came from NA to Europe. But CLG.EU was the one team that was so legitimate. They didn't get smashed in scrims. They were banning random stuff, and people were struggling versus them. They were CLG Europe and Moscow 5, even Koreans, like leading up to season 2 until like World Championships, we viewed them as the best teams in the world. And if there was a power ranking, like, I think they would have been placed over Korean teams before World Championships happened.
Yeah. Actually, I remember Edward once sent me a screenshot where like he'd been talking to Lost Boy, and Lost Boy had like, like Gosu Pepper rune page, and this was Edward like, see, I was the best. They all recognized I was the best. So true.
But that's the thing about like season 2 for me was kind of the rise of Europe. in a lot of ways, and with so many different play styles and so many different teams. Because you mentioned now teams that went to Worlds, but like Curse was a really successful team in Europe as well, with Extinct as the mid laner back then, which is also a very old school name, but it's another one of those guys who was considered one of the very best players in all of Europe. Like mechanically, he was insane. He could 1v9 games, but he never found enough success before he ended up quitting the game a year later. But we also had like teams like Millennium that obviously came in with a bunch of French lineups, and there were just so many different players and different teams that would be competing. But obviously, in the end, M5 and CLG.EU would be the best. And what I loved when I played against these different teams back and the different players was just the complete different styles. Like there was not a single team in the world that could play like M5. Like they came in and they said, no one knows us. Only a couple of our names are actually famous in high elo solo queue. Like Alex obviously was a known player in solo queue, but Diamond Prox, no one knew who this guy was. It didn't really exist. Genja as well was just this random dude that no one cared about, no one really heard about. And when they started playing, I remember specifically trying to make it as a jungler at the time, way back in early season 2, and champs like Shyvana and Lee Sin were considered really bad at first. Like they were just not considered really good champs to play because you needed junglers that could build gold per 10 items and just play by wards and then just sit there and assist your lanes. Like that was your job with a lot of the jungle champs. Like Maokai Junk, when he got released, was considered overpowered because he had point and click CC and he could buy gold per 10 items. But when you then started watching M5, and as you highlighted, Loco, like Diamond Prox understood that, okay, if my mid laner plays things like Mordekaiser, he will stand in the wave like level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and just push. And then we know with Mordekaiser, because we will always have to push, we can always invade on things like Shyvana, and all the slow junglers, like the tank junglers, couldn't do anything. Like they just lose everything around them. But I still did not see a team back then, even though it seemed so obvious, as you said, like this is how you should be playing the game. I didn't see any other European team try, or I didn't see any team succeed with their playstyle other than M5. So everyone else still tried to play around laners more than the jungler.
So nowadays, there's a lot of international competition, and there's a lot of VODs. You can just look up M5 versus CL, or like you can look up whatever team versus team you want to look, and you can find the VOD instantly, and you can review it, download all the information, and then just do it. Back then, VODs weren't really a thing, and it was really hard to look up. There weren't really a lot of stat sites, and you just heard, oh, this team won, and like there wasn't a lot of ways to see something and pull from it and implement it into your own game. And everyone was also extremely cocky because they won in their own regions, and we were really young and we were like beginning to be pro players, so we're like, we're the best, like we know everything, I don't care what you do is garbo. So it was hard to look up and everyone was cocky. So yeah, there wasn't a lot of learning from each other. Now there is, like nowadays.
Also, the scrim schedules back then barely existed. Like M5 would just disappear, and then a couple of weeks before a big tournament they would boot camp, the famous Russian boot camps, and they would show up, and in like the first game I remember like two really cool examples, one from bot lane, one from top lane. The famous bot lane play where they pick Urgot for Genja. Yes. They give him blue buff level 1, and then Edward just never goes bot lane. He just roams the map 24/7.
This is in the IEM final.
It was like it was one of those.
Yeah.
And he did it. I remember 100% correctly. It was on Tarek. He did it. So he had a point and click stun.
Yes.
And he could just walk into a lane, point and click stun, and Alex could just kill a guy. And you know, it blew everyone's mind because you hadn't seen that in scrims or in VODs, and you could be like, oh, if they do this, we should just tower dive the bot laner. No, they just tried to 2v1 push in an Urgot with blue buff, and they just couldn't do anything against him. And the other one, which I think a lot of old school people will remember, was Darian, when he played Gangplank, would get red buff level 1, walk into lane, and just start parley a guy in the face with a red buff, and you literally couldn't beat him in lane. And then they just never went top again. He just hard won his lane on his own with early red buff, and he just built like Atmos Impaler with Warmox, and he was just like, yeah, you're never killing this guy. So it's like these kind of strategies were insane.
You should explain what Atmos does, because no one knows but us two now what Atmos is.
So Atmos was obviously the item that after you build a couple of tank items, and especially when you stacked a ton of HP, if you build Atmos, a lot of that would then be turned into actual damage. And Loco, it had armor, and it had AD, and did it have crit on it? I don't think it had crit. It was just AD and armor.
Mm-hmm. I forget exactly what it had, but the main component was it was a double dipping item where if you get HP, it would turn into AD, and Riot hates those kind of items now, and they try not to put it in, but it was extremely efficient when combined with Warmogs.
As long as you got because that was the GP days of triple gold per 10 item into Warmogs into Atmos, and then you had your core.
Mm-hmm.
And if the enemy team didn't beat you in 25 minutes or something, you would just outscale forever. But it was obviously a very old GP. He didn't have barrels. He would shoot minions and buff his team, and it was
he could kill his own minions to deny.
He denied the cannon minion every time he shot it. So you hated playing against it, and that was the kind of stuff M5 brought out. Where to move on to CLG, the very famous lineup obviously with Wicked top lane. Snoopay was the jungler. We had Froggen in mid lane. It was Froggen's big year. Yellow Pete bot lane, and then Crepo as support. And you had the most boring team in a way compared to M5, because it was all about playing it safe in the early game.
Turtle.
Super strong scaling. The famous Anivia from Froggen coming in. Yellow Pete wasn't by no means a lane bully, so he also kind of fit into this play style. And it was only Wicked who wanted to play super aggressive things like Irelia all the time, and he wanted to try and win his lane, which was great for most of Season 2 until Worlds, when Wicked and his carry champs got banned out, and the famous Wicked champion pool memes would start, where when he lost Irelia, it would be Malphite, and then if it wasn't one of those two, it would just kind of completely fall apart for him. But it was so cool to watch the rivalry between these two teams, because again, you had hyper aggressive Diamond Prox and M5 versus very defensive CLG, and M5 was a lot about playing around multiple lanes depending on what kind of comp you had with it, where CLG was very much around Froggen. Froggen was the star player. Froggen was your main win condition in the late game. If you ask Wicked, he will tell you otherwise. He will say he was the main win condition. But I guarantee you, Froggen was the star player.
Okay.
And so, I mean, he obviously had you know him as well from Korea.
Yeah. So I actually know that team pretty well, and I know Wicked and Froggen well. So I'll add a little sprinkles. Wicked's theory was, if I always play my jungler's there, they'll never know if he's actually there or not. So he played overly aggressive all the time. So when it worked great. When it didn't work, it didn't work. So Wicked was a funny dude. He was a great earlier, and he's a great person, but his understanding of the game was very one-dimensional. And I still think it is to this day, very one-dimensional.
But that's what I love about him, is that Wicked through many years, he was in Season 1. He was considered a super good player already in Season 1.
Yes.
Young, top, he was, when the ranking system came out, he was famously the first person to reach 2,000 elo.
Yeah.
When he played Master Yi and so on as well a ton, and he was mechanically a very gifted player, but he never adapted to changes in the game throughout the LCS years. He was very good back then when there was a lot of different playstyles. The game wasn't really figured out, and he had his very focused carry style. It worked really well for CLG, but it obviously didn't really work too well after Season 2.
So one thing I will say is Froggen as a mid laner was so good back then. Just extremely accurate with skill shot, very good defensively, and he would almost never die and make very few mistakes. I think the skill gap between Froggen and the next mid was insane. I wish League was more famous back then, because Froggen was just insane and a lot of people caught up to him. But yeah, Froggen was the core of CLG.EU, and the team it wasn't built around Froggen initially, but it became about Froggen. His Lux, his Anivia, because he could wave clear infinitely, and Baron didn't buff minions back then. It didn't matter how ahead you were. Yes. Froggen wasn't going to die, and he was going to be able to wave clear with Anivia, with Lux, and the game would drag on to a point where they would have 6 items, and Froggen and Yellow Pete, that backline, would farm up to those items, and they would be at a 50-50, and their team fighting was better. So it was impossible. Yeah, it was impossible.
Best mid lane in the world.
A couple of years ago, like literally, we're talking only maybe like 2 years ago, when I was at one of the CS:GO majors, Froggen, who was living in NA at the time, and he came along, and Ocelot was there because Ocelot was getting into being a team owner. And when the two of them were talking to me at this after party, what's funny is they even were like reminiscing over the old times of when Froggen came up. And Ocelot even said that back then, because if you remember back then, people loved to like fight in lane and try and get solo kills, and especially the mid laners. You know, a lot of the champions, it's AP, so you know you've got a burst champion where if you catch a guy early, you try and smash the lane. Ocelot even said he just had no clue what was happening all the time when he was playing Froggen, because he kept going like this guy just farms the minions. Like, why is he just only farming the minions? Whereas Ocelot said he would just go to lane, just kill the minions haphazardly, like whatever, I missed a couple, doesn't really matter, you know, like where's this guy? Like, well, I'm going to get ready for the next fight. Like, should I all in now? Should I flash up onto the tower? And he said obviously all Froggen did was just go up, like stand at a safe distance, make sure he last hit every minion, and then just wait for the next minion wave to come. So the whole point is the paradigm just shattered, because everyone else thought, they didn't realize you could just play sort of the macro game. You know, you only did that if you were actively behind, and you had to.
You also had like the thing about was he was like the first mid laner to introduce taking raptors. At least
35 in Europe.
He knew he would just perma push his lane. As you said, without trading, go to Raptors, kill the Raptor camp, go back, push another wave, go to his Wolf camp, kill the Wolf camp, go back to push the lane, and then wait for Raptors to spawn again. So Snoopy, who was, I gotta give him the credit, he was like the greatest support jungler ever. Yes. Because I don't think he ever really complained. He
played jungle as it was like what hard support is in Dota now, where you just have nothing, you get no gold.
He built Heart of Gold, he built Philosopher's Stone. Both items have been removed now, but obviously it was like Heart of Gold gave a bit of HP and then gold per 10, and Philosopher's Stone gave HP and MR
mana regen.
Mana regen, HP regen, and a bit of gold, and that was it. And that was the same items the support would run around with for like 30 minutes. Same thing for Snoopy. Like, he legit sometimes wouldn't get anything else because he didn't have any jungle camps to kill, and his job was to make sure he never died.
Yeah,
like, I mean, he didn't have to do anything other than just protect mid.
One credit to Snoopy is a lot of teams fell apart because they couldn't function as like just group of 5 young, early 20s, late teen dudes. But Snoopy was on the older side, and he kept that team together. He was very, like, Wicket's a strong personality, Krepo's a strong personality, Froggen's a strong personality, and Snoopy, while he wasn't the best player, he was a supported player in game, and outside of the game, he kept that team together, and I thought that he played a really important part in CLG.EU's dominance. I think Froggen's the most important, and second is Snoopy, not for in-game reasons, but combination of out-of-game and in-game. I think Snoopy and Froggen were the reasons why CLG.EU stayed together for a long time and were very good for a long time.
And also why they became, together with M5, like the fan favorites going into Worlds. Everyone loved these two teams. Like, it was kind of like the good guys on the CLG.EU versus the bad guys on M5, but because M5 were stomping everyone and winning, and they were doing it for Europe, you know, everyone were just cheering for them. They were loving, you know, M5. Whenever M5 had to play against like TSM and so on, like, it was amazing to watch because TSM would be there and like try and smack talk a little bit. I remember IEM Kiev, I believe it was, where the Rain Man famously in some of the vlogs beforehand would talk about how they're just gonna shit on M5. It's gonna be easy, and then like the final is just like smack 20 minutes, and TSM are just lying bleeding on the ground.
And then Raymond retired.
Yeah, then, you know, he disappeared. But it was stuff like that. I really think helped bring League of Legends more, you know, towards the general European fan compared to just NA streamers and NA teams, which again was kind of the big deal at first. Because there were so many teams now you could get behind, and they were successful. They were winning. CLG almost won OGN, which was huge back then. Like, Krepo to this day will still talk to me about this. Diana picked a lock-in for some reason when it backfires.
We should have just picked Anivia. Like, he actually talked to me about that too. I forgot where the last time I talked to Krepo was about that. It was about that OGN tournament and how to this day he regrets not telling Froggen to pick Anivia because he was afraid. I remember that. Oh my god.
Because Froggen had apparently played Diana solo queue, it went really well, he picked it, and then the second thing we'll also talk about is how the black shield was just, I believe, 1 second away from cooldown when Skarner grabs onto either Froggen or
Yellow Pete, I believe he got.
It was on the Yellow Pete, and the black shield, it was so close, but it didn't happen. Cloud Templar got him, and then CLG lose after being up in the series, and it could have been a great moment. But going into Worlds, to get to the real point of this, I know we talked about a power ranking before, and it was hard to do, but CLG.EU and M5, to me, were the two favorites to win this tournament. Coming into it, it was obviously also looking at from Korea, we had Azubu, Frost. People did respect Azubu Frost. We had World Elite, obviously, which was also respected. Sure. But without being too biased, to me, M5 and CLG.EU were the two best teams in the world. And I still think it should have been CLG versus M5 in that final.
Okay. I think there's so much bias because Azubu Frost beat CLG.EU to get to that tournament. To say they're the two best teams in the world, I think it's fair to say World Elite, Azubu Frost, CLG Europe, or CLG.EU and Moscow 5. Those are the 4 teams that were the favorites. But to put the CLG Europe and Moscow 5 up there is blunt fanboyism.
That's all I got from Season 2, baby. These two teams were going to do it. No one counted TPA for anything.
Yeah.
They surprised everyone. No one believed in TSM, at least European fans didn't believe in TSM whatsoever. They did make it out of groups, however, by getting seeded straight into a quarterfinal, and then they managed to lose that one very quickly. But the best of 5 or best of 3 was actually back then in the semifinals. I remember the most was the TPA versus M5, where, again, because TPA was still even at that point considered kind of underdogs going into it, M5 were just like, they were supposed to smash this 2-0 and go to the final, but then they just had no answer for Stanley on Nidalee in the top lane, just going crazy. And watching M5 struggle to adapt in a series was very surprising, I remember, back then again, because they used to have so many different strategies and styles, but it just didn't work, and they didn't ban Nidalee in the last game, and then it just hard carries, man.
Wow, you remember so much. You remember this so accurately.
I just remember specifically sitting and watching this, as a person who's competed against M5 a lot of online qualifiers and tournaments, and remembering all the different things they've done also from tournaments, and then not seeing them make the final because, in my opinion, they didn't ban Nidalee, even though they already lost to it once, was pretty devastating as a European fan.
Okay. So moving to Season 3, the LCS era came along. We had the Fnatic team win both the splits, but in interesting fashion, because the detail that people need to understand is, even though Fnatic had taken in Reckless after Season 2, before LCS began, he was technically not old enough to play until actually the Season 3 World Championship. He could have come in like halfway through. And so what happened was they had Yellow Star as their AD carry in the spring split, and then early in the summer, they kicked out N-rated. Yellow Star role swapped to support player, and at the time, while they were waiting till Reckless was of age, they brought in this player Pushu, who I think he was from Estonia or something. So a player who not very well known now, but at the time, came as a stand-in. They still won the split anyway, although the difference is, in the spring split, them and M5, who were now Gambit, were the two best teams, back and forth. In the summer split was the one where it's the infamous split where at one point in time, like almost every single team in the league got their time to be ranked number 1, no joke. And at the end, the last week went down to like a 5-way tie for first place or something mental. So, and I remember one team that lost like 2 games was in relegation the last week, and the other ones were like battling for the top one. So Fnatic winning the summer one,
It was tiebreaker for second place.
Yes,
first place was already locked by Lemon Dogs.
Right.
But yes, you are correct.
Okay, so the point anyway on that one is the summer split obviously was very, very competitive, and yes, as you say, even though Lemon Dogs won the regular part of the split. They lost the final to Fnatic, obviously Fnatic veterans in playoff scenarios. And then, because as the same system in the past, it was just the playoffs of the summer split was the qualifier. The team that ended up going as the third team for the region was obviously Gambit, yes, because they played against at the time, Evil Geniuses, which was basically CLG.EU's lineup, and it was the third place decider, and Gambit ended up going. And Gambit themselves, detailed to note as well, also had a different player because they didn't have Edward. He was actually in NA with Curse. Instead, they had Voidal, who...
Yeah. And before that, they had a guy called Darker, who they played with at the start of the
For a couple of weeks,
For a couple of weeks before they benched him.
Okay, so here's the thing, Deficio. This is another Worlds where, some solid results for Europe, like... Obviously, Fnatic made it to the semi-finals. Gambit made the playoffs. The Lemon Dogs team didn't make it out, but to be fair, they were in the group that had OMG and SK Telecom, and only 2 teams got out of each of the groups. Like, what do you think Season 3 Worlds was like for Europe? Because, to set the scene, as you said there, in Season 2, at the very least, even Loco conceded. There were favourites for Worlds that were from Europe. Whether you thought they were the best team overall or not, they were absolute favourites. So what was Season 3 like in contrast?
So, Season 3 for me will always be one of my favorite years in terms of just new names kind of coming into the scene, and also Fnatic becoming the #1 team, which obviously ends up being the case for quite a lot of the LCS history. But going into Worlds specifically, I actually remember having almost no faith in the European teams because what ended up happening during the regular season was Lemon Dogs, they joined... they promoted into LCS in the relegation tournament coming into summer, and they had the lineup with Nukedog in the mid lane, Mythy support, Taps was the AD carry.
No, they started without Mythy, if you remember. They actually had We Will Fail.
They had We Will Fail for a couple of weeks, He always finds his way into something.
He does, doesn't he?
And then he got kicked pretty quickly, I believe already week 2 or 3 he was out, and Mythy joined, but then Dexter was the jungler, and Zoro Zero was the top laner. One of another lost star player in Europe that disappeared too early. But that lineup came in and kind of changed a lot of things in Europe, even without probably knowing that they were actually doing it, because they were so smart at how to play split push, because of Nukedog, who could just literally shock call the entire team. And then he could also play Zed and Fizz at the highest level.
And this is obviously the super assassin meta as well. So you could
it
really
was Zed,
farm one
Fizz,
guy up.
Ahri, it was just assassins everywhere. Every European mid laner had to be able to play. And we had the peak of European mid laners during that summer split, where it was Bjergsen was fighting against Nukedog, who was fighting against Xpeke, who was fighting against Froggen, who was fighting against Alex Ish. You just had insane names. And this is actually why a lot of fans, when they talk about Bjergsen in Europe, will reference and saying he wasn't the best player, best mid laner when he came to NA, which was one of the things people tried to say, but he was probably ranked number 5 back then among European mid laners because it was just so stacked. And Nukedog, he was able to shock call for basically his entire team, especially his jungler, to tell him what he needed to do in the early game to play around Nukedog. Then Nukedog could go to a side lane, play this assassin, win the 1v1 while calling his entire team around so they knew what to do on the map. And it was just so impressive to watch, and it forced every team to try and adapt and learn the same split push strategy that Lemon Dogs used to do. But it was just very hard to do it as well as they did because they had some really gifted players, and again, they had some very smart players as well. So they get #1 the regular season, and to me they were kind of what I expected coming into the tournament. They were going to be Europe's hope, but when they lose the final to Fnatic, and they get it put into the tough group, the really tough group with SKT and so on, because they were the second seed instead of the first seed, I kind of lost faith. Also with Fnatic playing with Pushu and Yellowstar support, because to me that Fnatic bot lane was one of the worst in Europe.
Can I touch on the Lemon Dogs thing a little? Didn't they lose finals because they went out to drink or something right before? I remember that.
That was definitely a big party the day before, yes.
So the problem is obviously they'd qualified for Worlds already. Yeah, that's the issue, So because just making the final means you qualified. Unfortunately, there was a few finals that we won't mention them all, but there was the same storyline played out.
I swear to God, I'm not gonna say who, but up to 2016 and even to 2017 somewhat. Europe has drinking and partying before big international play dates have been Europe's one of biggest downfalls. It's been a common theme since season 1 to 27, almost up to 2017.
It's probably true. It's actually a comment I hear a lot whenever we have people visiting from North America. They often talk about how the European team atmosphere is so different because all the players, especially in season 3, but also happened later, like after the LCS days were done, you finish your games, everyone would just go to a bar together. And
I heard there was like
enjoy it.
One European LCS bar where everyone just goes.
Everyone would go there, and so everyone would just hang out, and everyone would chill together and become really good friends. So it was a very different atmosphere, I think, compared to NA, where you couldn't drink because a lot of players would be under 21.
Europe is 18, right?
It's 18, but I mean, yeah.
They're also, they wouldn't as strictly ID you back then. You'd probably
exactly.
be fine if you were with everyone else. Yeah.
So it was very easy, right, for everyone to just enjoy a lot of time together. But yeah, so the Lemondogs lineup obviously lost the first seed, and the Fnatic team, because as I said with the bot lane, I played with Freeze at the time, and whenever we scrimmed Fnatic, we would just win bot lane. Like Yellowstar was an AD carry; he had no clue what to do, and Pusho obviously was not considered a star player either. When he joined, he was kind of just a filler, and Reckless couldn't play. I remember they used Reckless in scrims from time to time. Also to try and teach Yellowstar more about the support role. But that Fnatic lineup to me didn't look that scary. So when they went to Worlds and they managed to get top 4, I was actually very surprised. And I was very impressed with how they managed to play around the issue in the bot lane. Because it was the very famous like Yellowstar Leona, where out of nowhere he would go from just hard feeding to pick Leona, and he would just all in everything. And they had these strategies with Cyanide as well, playing things like Jarvan, where he would just like perma gank level 2, 3, 4, 5, and they would like snowball early games. Good old Aatrox became a thing. I don't remember if that was season 3, but it might have been, or it might have been season 4 later. But they managed to find ways to still succeed despite having no real bot lane they could actually use at a world championship. And that was just a lot of credit to them.
Peke was an insane player to that standard, and he got his hands on Kassadin versus Cloud9 in quarters, and I think that's what really like pushed them forward. Like they were a very scrappy team. They didn't have a functioning bot lane, as you mentioned, but they probably had second or maybe the third best mid laner in Peke at the tournament. So, and they really won off the back of that and off of Cyanide supporting Peke.
Yeah, because Cyanide was kind of the upgraded version of what Snoopy used to be. Because Cyanide never played for himself, he always played for his laners. He always sacrificed himself for lanes, but he didn't do it in the pick a tank jungler, build gold per 10 and do nothing. Like, he would actually play like really hardcore ganking junglers, and he would just be extremely proactive, especially around solo lanes. Because Source back then as well, he was really, really good, and he could play a ton of different carries. He was really strong on mage champions that obviously ended up being the meta for a lot of season 3 summer, with like Lissandra especially being played a lot in the top lane, and he was really good at playing these different picks. So Fnatic had like a super strong early setup because they had good solo laners and a good early jungler. They just had really scrappy like team fights, scrappy late games, as we saw from a lot of teams, and still it was enough with Kassadin obviously versus C9.
Well, if you remember, there was also the other angle which made them a bit different at Worlds, which is like, first of all, they would play the double teleport because also would. This is before top laners took teleport. Obviously at the time, if you could take a carry top lane, you're going to take Ignite or something, or whatever it might be in that scenario. So that was a different. This is one of the reasons why all the NA players and a lot of analysts didn't think Europe would do very well. They thought that this didn't make sense in the global meta. And then also, as you were alluding to there, Deficio, there was a lot of scenarios where if Fnatic was in any trouble, they did what the infamous Fnatic brush, where they just all hide in one brush. And what's mad is you'd watch it and you'd think this gimmick isn't going to work. It worked so many times. It was unbelievable how many times they pulled it off.
Oh, I want to say one thing about teleport. So teleport functioned differently back then. Whenever you were teleporting on a ward, it wouldn't show. So now when you teleport, it shows, someone's teleporting there. But back then it wouldn't show because so you'd be laning bottom, and then suddenly a champion would pop up behind you and then start engaging on you, and you had no idea someone was teleporting. So teleport in top lane and in mid lane was revolutionary.
Okay.
Also had way less cooldown than now, which was another thing. But I think the only other team to touch on there was Gambit, obviously. And another reason for why I just didn't believe a lot in Europe was I didn't actually consider Gambit a good team in Season 3 summer. I think the fact they had to travel, like, it was actually insane because back then Riot would pay flights for teams who didn't have a gaming house, and they would pay for the hotel in Cologne. So half the teams, like the big teams like Fnatic and these kind of guys, had gaming houses, and the rest of us would like travel in, live in a hotel, practice at the ESL office, and then go back to the hotel and fly back home after the weekend. And M5 or Gambit, Riot had agreed to do this, obviously, which I think was probably a bit annoying for them. It turned out that the 5 Gambit players all came from 5 different places. 4 of them from different places in Russia, and I think Armenia from Edward.
Yes.
And like the flights they had to take, I remember Edward telling me he had to like fly to Moscow, lay over in Moscow for like 3-4 hours, then fly from Moscow to Dusseldorf, to then take the train from Dusseldorf to
I believe Edward said each week his travel used to be like 30 hours one way.
God damn.
Because, you know, he was not just doing flights, he was doing a train that would be like 8 hours or something, you know.
It was just like,
and they did this every week for LCS, because remember, LCS was like, you know, towards the weekend. So it's actually amazing that they even made it to Worlds in that scenario. Like, fair play, these guys are legends.
That's the thing, that's why you know they're legends, because they barely could practice during the entire year, actually, ever since LCS got introduced. So naturally their level kind of dropped, which was why during Summer Split season 3, they were not considered a top team in Europe, which was kind of weird because it was Gambit, right? It was the same players, except for down the support where Edward had gone and left. But they became really easy to play against. They just play kind of really cheesy junglers. They played like Karma jungle randomly from Diamond Prox out of nowhere. And that was kind of the only thing you were scared of. So when we lost to them at Gamescom, because we lost Extinct, he left our team with NIP. We were like, damn, this was we should have won the semifinal so badly. But I was like, okay, but they're not gonna go to Worlds. And then they play EG, or the old CLG.EU, in that 3rd place game, and I'm like, this is a 2-0. Like, CLG.EU will win this for sure. But Gambit, they just find a way. Alex like plays out of his mind, and they actually beat them and go to Worlds. And even at Worlds, they got out of groups, which was just like unbelievable to me, because this team was just, they were done. Like,
well, think about how you contrasted the Season 2 one. So in Season 2, the whole thing was Gambit, like you said, with a team that could beat you in 20 minutes. And they were doing all these weird lane priority and like counter jungling and so aggressive. So what made them super famous was this super, like, you know, bulldozer style, as it were. Season 3, they still had some epic results, but it was all like coming from behind and having to win like some god-tier team fight when you should lose the game. So yeah, obviously this wasn't a team that was going to win Worlds in Season 3.
All right, let's go to Season 4. This is going to be fun.
No, Season 4 didn't happen. Season 5.
All right, Soren, why don't you lead us into Season 4?
Sure. So in Season 4 was when Reckless was now fully in the Fnatic team. Fnatic won the spring split, which was the one that was like a ramp-up period in the spring split. Because if you remember, the actual team that won the regular split was actually the SK Gaming lineup, which was in theory all the like cat teams, players that had been thrown away. So they'd got like Enrated who'd come back, you know, Svenskeren had been out of the game for a while. You had players that people barely even knew, like Freddy122. They actually... They were able, they had Jesus as a mid laner. They were able to win the regular split, but then, as often happened, Fnatic was always like super clutch in the playoffs. And in line with what you said, Loco, about partying, it was actually quite famous with like, forget Fnatic, it was just Expected and Soaz really, that like, they sort of like knew you can fuck around a bit in the regular split, you know, as long as when the playoffs come, you practice and you actually play properly. And there's some mad stories along the way of like Soaz just like not even playing meta champions and then just going like, I'll pick it up when the playoffs come. And obviously he could do it because he just has mad talent in that sense. So Fnatic was able to win the split, and crucially one of the teams they beat along the way was the Alliance team, which was supposed to be Froggen's super team, which started really, really badly, even though they had all this amazing scrim hype. Did get very good though by the end of the split, and then obviously obviously in summer, they actually took over as the number one team, and they had a very, very dominant record. They won the split, beating Fnatic, but Fnatic was still a very good team themselves. And at that point in time, the SK team, who, as I said, on paper, should never have been the best team, they did respectably manage to slide in as the third spot and go to Worlds. And obviously, unfortunately, we never really got to see what they did because they had the infamous Svenskeren suspension. So we'll never really know.
How's the benefactor of that? So I'm okay. So one thing I want to touch on was Peke and Soaz. They're victims of their own talent. They were so talented and they were so good. They didn't develop good habit of practice because they never needed to. And they're still successful. I mean, Soaz is still playing at a top level to this day, but during those seasons, they were a victim of their own immaturity and their own talents.
I mean, this was an era, by the way, just for context, where, to be fair, Fnatic wasn't a team using a real coach. They basically just were their own coach and managed their own team. So yeah, there wasn't the professionalism in Europe in the same sense.
I want to touch on. Go ahead. No, I want to touch on Alliance a little bit because I was pretty close to Alliance, and a lot of people might not know, but I actually coached Alliance for about a week or two, and then Andy reached out to me about coaching TSM, and I mean, I if Andy calls for me, it doesn't matter what I'm doing, I'm gonna go with Andy. So
is that a hint from now, or
no. But we'll talk about that one other day. But I remember coaching Alliance. Oh my god, it was hard to coach Alliance. Froggen and Wicked were super stubborn, and when I was coaching Alliance, there was this guy named Leviathan. He was also coaching Alliance under me, and when I left, Leviathan just became the coach. And that team was a shit show. I'll tell you how I picked up Parth and how I met Parth. So Leviathan would have a Skype group, and it would be this hive mind where he would get a bunch of analysts from Twitter and Reddit, and it would be a 20 analyst group, and he would type in a question: what should we do versus Najin Shield? How should we lane swap? And people would give their answers, and he would pick through whatever he thought was the best answer and use it. And how I met Parth was part of that hive mind group, and he was like, okay, this shit is fucking crazy. And Parth posted onto Reddit his work that he did for Alliance, which was scouting reports, and that was something I was really into, and I was personally doing myself for GSM. And that's how I also picked up Dylan, who's head coach of Fnatic. People would post their work onto Reddit, and I'd be like, oh, this guy's really good, I want to hit him up. Pay them $100 a week to become our analyst, and getting paid work and working for TSM was dank. So they would come and work for us, and that's how I picked up Parth and Dylan through Reddit. And I would have never met Parth if it wasn't for Leviathan's Skype group of 20 people hive mind. Oh man, Alliance was quite a team back then.
Dude, fucking Alliance.
Oh man, they were a funny team, but Froggen, made his they won a split, right? If I'm correct.
Yeah, they won the summer split very dominantly.
Fnatic.
Yeah, they won a split.
Summer.
So Froggen got his win there, and I got to pick up Parth there. So, yeah, great for everyone outside of Alliance.
Except for Europe at Worlds, but we'll probably get to that because.
Well, let's talk about that then.
Sorry.
Let's talk about Worlds then.
Okay, fine. So,
because here's the thing: one of the things that is always downplayed about this Worlds result is this is one of the biggest what if Worlds ever, because every single one of these European teams has their own what if. So SK has the what if of, well, they didn't even play half the games with the real lineup, and then when they did play one of the games with the real lineup, they beat this team called TSM. Then you have the Fnatic team. People forget this. Okay, Fnatic didn't get out the group. They beat Samsung Blue in a game, and they were one hit on a Nexus from beating OMG, and they would have got out the group. Third team, Alliance, well, they lost to Kaboom. That's the only reason they weren't in the tiebreaker. So that's a match where you play that match 100 times. I won't say they win it every time, but they win a lot of them.
90%, yeah.
So I mean,
adding on to Alliance, they came off perfect gaming Najin White Shield with Shook, who was the classic 10-0 or 0-10 jungler. Went 10-0, they hard stomped them, and obviously as an analyst at the time, it felt to me okay, they just proved that they can be the best team in this group. They fully deserve to advance from it. They just need to beat Kaboom. Then for sure they will beat C9 in this tiebreaker with how they just played in this game we watched here. And they get this stupid draft. terrible draft of Kale top lane for Wicked and Fizz for Froggen.
Reddit hive mind.
It is a disrespect, like complete disrespect, especially the Kale top was complete garbage. Like, what on earth was that?
I mean, for context, it's worth pointing out. Like, I know now people understand that wildcards can do stuff. Like, it wasn't even from this Worlds we learned that, obviously it was later on teams like later Brazilian teams, Flash Wolves, weren't technically a wildcard, but, like they were outside of the major regions everyone considered. But at the time, yes, the reason why you could do this is because it was just considered a free win if you had a wildcard team in your group. Like, they were never going to win any of these matches.
You know how people talk about if Reddit coached a team? That was Alliance. They had no coach. Players got to run over what they wanted, and he literally took information from that Skype group and gave it to players. So
yes.
But I think that was all the European teams' problem Season 4. I think every single team was ran just by players. Because Fnatic, as we just talked about before here, like it was Soaz and Peke and whatever they wanted to do. So if they didn't feel like practicing for whatever reason, tough luck. You're not practicing, right? But that Fnatic lineup, I started.
What really a monster lineup that was.
It was insane because Reckless in his first year, I know later there's a lot of chats about how passive he can be as an AD carry, but in Season 4 when he joined the league, he became the MVP basically instantly, and him and Yellowstar would just wreck everyone. Like, it's insane how well they actually played. But funny enough, where we said how Peck and Soaz in Season 3 were insane and a huge reason for why Fnatic could go to top 4 at Worlds, Season 4 was actually the year where a lot of people started criticizing, especially Soaz, but also Peck quite a lot, because their level, like, they stopped being consistent. They stopped being like superstars almost in a lot of the games, and it became much more about just the bottom lane with Reckless. And I always look at that Fnatic lineup and I say, man, if they'd just been able to continue the Soaz Peke kind of skill and trends from Season 3 and put that with Reckless, and they had like, if they get put into today's world,
if you could take all 5 players in that team at whatever peak in history it was in a time machine and put them all together, that'd be a pretty fucking good lineup.
That would be an insane lineup.
With good infrastructure, they would have done really well. And I'm not sure how easy it would have been to Peke and Soaz. Maybe there was a coach they could have respected. But I'm not sure Peke and Soaz back then would have respected coaches enough to fall in line.
They wouldn't, Loco, because all you need to know is this. When they were in Origen, if you remember, they actually had a guy who was a coach. He later went on to coach Rockat. And he basically left them before they went to Worlds and said, these guys don't need me, because basically they didn't even consider like coaching a real thing. And I actually did a reflections with Soaz the year later, and he basically said, I've basically never been coached. And I was like, but you literally had like a couple of coaches. And he was like, and it was almost like, yeah, that's the implication. Like to them, a coach was like what you said about Leviathan. It's the guy who comes in and says, like, it's like a nerd who comes in like, oh, here sir, I've heard these are the top champions. And then you go like, yeah, I'll read that report later. See you, mate. I'll pick whatever I want. And then obviously the problem is, as you alluded to though, Loco, it's the success. Like, if they'd have failed a few times, they might have thought, right, well, maybe we need to change something. But they always came back in the playoffs. They always made it to these world championships. They always could compete, because the other thing is they were obviously very clutch players as well. So, unfortunately, I guess that made them not have to learn the hard lessons, if you know what I mean. And obviously, this was the Worlds where Europe had to learn the hard lesson.
Not a single team made it out in the end, as you mentioned. All the clutch moments kind of went against Europe, and I think also just overall, like, Europe was weak. Like, the EU LCS splits in Season 4 were very low level, and it was like there were so many teams being swapped in and out. Like, it was obviously the first time we got to see the full Polish lineup, Rockets lineup. That was KMT before that, and they were kind of fun. There was a team called Super Hot Crew that people will not remember now, but that was the team that had like Kissing came in on that, and Impaler was on it, Selfie was on it, and like there were so many scrappy teams everywhere, and it was a mess. So SK even becoming like the best regular season team was a statement in hindsight of the current level, because that lineup was not good on paper.
But the thing about that team famously was that was part of the reason why people always respected and rated so much, because they were a team that put in effort to learning the macro and how do we play around map pressure and which towers do you take. And at the time, you have all these superstar players. Think of all the mid laners in Europe. That's the indictment right there, right, Deficio. If you can have Jesus basically just pick Ziggs and sit in the mid lane and farm, and you can not win the split, but win the regular part of the split in Europe, where it's the region of mid laners. That says something about where the region was at.
And also just in general, as we highlighted with the Fnatic players, I just felt like the overall level of the superstars just kind of started dropping. And even players like Froggen, while he was individually one of the best, his play style and the way he wanted just to play the game to look, it just never changed. And the further we got into these seasons, the more other teams started catching up and just abusing it, because the Froggen you saw in Season 4 would be the same Froggen you used to see in Season 2. Like, he wanted to win his mid lane, he wanted to focus on just his own lane, and he wouldn't try and play anything else. And CLG, or Alliance, while they ended up winning the split, it was by no means, an easy win. They weren't, like, easily the best team we had. It was actually fairly hard for them to do, and a lot of it relied, obviously, on Froggen, but also on Shook. To show up in the big moments, because he was the kind of guy who could be the best jungler in Europe and he could be the worst jungler in Europe, depending on the day. But in the end, Alliance, despite also having Wicked as kind of a weak link at that point up in the top lane, managed to win, also because they ended up being like solid.
Deficio, how weird is that as well, right? So I will say Irelia was not a meta champion in Season 4 Worlds, but like that's one of the wins they got as well. Wicked actually just got to pick Irelia at Worlds. You just want to go like, where are the scouting reports for these teams? Like, is Najin Shield not aware of like Irelia and Wicked? Like, sort of a thing,
Well, then he got to play Kayle the last game, and I rewatched the Kaboom game not too long ago.
Why would you do that to yourself? Are you a masochist or something?
I wanted to make sure I remembered how it all went wrong, and like
when you loaded up the game, I bet you have that thing as well. Like, when you watch a movie that's one of your favourites where like the hero dies, when you watch it, part of why it's effective is you go like, oh, I hope he doesn't die this time, even though he does. Like, I bet it's like that when you load the VOD, right? You're like, they can still do this thing, come back.
Those dumb early game ganks definitely didn't happen whenever I wanted to watch my dream version of Kaboom versus Alliance. Ari landing random charms, Kayle ultis being late, of course. Froggen trying to jump in 1v5 for no reason.
They had no engage with that comp, so he had to do that.
It was just, everything just went.
At the end of the game, Froggen literally had to like flash ult into groups of people just to get a team fight. So it's like, if that's, and by the way, if the person you're making do that is Froggen, who we've just said is like one of the most safe, like keep your distance, play very, like, you're probably not in a good position win condition wise at this point in time.
But in hindsight, I'm glad it actually happened, because it leads on to Season 5, which to me was kind of the new era of EU LCS.
Well, Deficio, here's the thing, right? If we set Season 4 up as like Europe was behind in infrastructure, obviously Season 5 we're going to get DLO and we're going to get this, infrastructure that starts to get introduced, right?
You see that transition right there. You get the old teams that kind of stop caring about the game enough, and they all kind of drop in level. EU is a mess. They have this dumb color cast who can't speak English, and like it was terrible. And then Season 5 happens, and that was also
he could speak English. He was just doing it with a Danish accent. So
yeah, that's true.
That was the problem, right?
But Season 5, and this is actually something I will never forget. Season 5 started, and it was at the time when we had we went from 8 teams to 10 teams. We had guys like Unicorns of Love joining the EU LCS. I remember Monte Cristo was sitting on his high horse from Korea talking about rotations every day, and I remember just hard flaming Europe. Probably with you, Thorin, just being like, this is garbage. Everything they do is just clown fiesta, especially Unicorns of Love were not a team that Monte Cristo liked.
But it's the fact that they were one game from winning the ULCS title. It wasn't a good look, I can say. Like, people doing flash Udyr bear slaps to win fights. Like, that's, like, if you do it, you have to tip your hat and go, well done, you made it work. But, like, that, you can't in your mind go, yeah, they'd do well against SK Telecom and, like, the Chinese teams. You can't see it happening.
But they were crazy enough, man, and they introduced so many things. So that split also had H2K, obviously got introduced, and they made it to Worlds. which ended up being like kind of a big deal for them and a big story. Alliance disbanded, or not didn't disband, but Alliance like
turned into Elements, which turned out to be shit.
Yeah,
they turned into Elements, right? Yeah,
exactly. So the Alliance organization disappeared. They became Elements. They picked up Reckless, obviously in the 2015 spring split. So kind of Fnatic got broken apart because then Xpeke and Soas famously obviously ended up also leaving, and the whole thing was just like it was a new region. It was a new league basically.
Yes.
No one really knew what they could expect from a lot of lineups. Also, SK Gaming with Forgiven ended up being a pretty big deal in Europe. But I remember specifically sitting and looking at the lineups before Season 5 started, going through all the different ones. And there were so many of the lineups where I just kind of going like, who the fuck is that guy? Like, I don't even know half these players on a lot of teams, like on Unicorns and on Fnatic, where Huni showed up together.
Huni Rainover.
It was Huni Rainover from Fnatic, and it was back then Steelback AD carry, together with Yellow Star, and then Febiven had just qualified in the expansion tournament with H2K, and then instantly Fnatic signed him, so he never got to play in the LCS for H2K, and that lineup on paper was just the biggest question mark for me, because I knew nothing about Huni. Like, he'd never played a professional game in his life. He just played on practice teams in Korea. Rainover was famously known as Game Over because he just lost everything and he was terrible in Korea. Febem was a rookie mid laner, and Steelback was a new AD carry who had done nothing, like, and who was not considered a good player entering the LCS. So you look at that lineup as a European fan and as a European caster, and you think to yourself, it's Fnatic, so they have to be good. But you can't really predict.
I can give you a bit of insight on this, Deficio, because people are aware of this story I've told. I waited a few years, so there was it wouldn't be BM to Fnatic, and I asked them. But basically, in the off season of Season 4 was when Fnatic actually wanted me to be their League of Legends coach. And so as a result, I actually knew behind the scenes all of the potential roster moves that were happening. And basically, I wouldn't have done it anyway. Like, it was just like a cool idea for 2 weeks. And then I said, like, this doesn't actually make that much sense. Like, our careers aren't going to go this way. Like, I'm not going to be the coach of Fnatic for 10 years, am I? Like, just, even if I did it, it'd be a short-term thing. So what happened was, when they initially talked to me about it, that's when they were like, right, it's possible, maybe Soaz will stay, Xpeke might leave, we're not 100% about Reckless. I mean, I actually already knew it behind the scenes. That was the done deal. He was going to Alliance Elements, But as a result, what happened was, as I was talking to them, each week, they'd be going, yeah, Xpeke's out now, Cyanide's probably not coming back, and I would be saying, like, okay, but who are we getting though? Like, if we're going to get players, you must be getting me some sick players. Like, who am I getting? Am I getting I was saying stuff like, get me Svenskeren as jungler, these players, like, people who are really good and could do something amazing. And then they were literally telling me stuff like, well, we met this guy called Huni when we were at Worlds, who's like on the Samsung C team, and I'm going like, what the why the fuck are we getting some Korean who's never played? And then they're telling me this, like, oh, we could maybe get Febiven as mid lane. I go, you mean the guy who every LAN with like Cloud9 Eclipse or whatever was just chalking up every LAN party and like never could qualify? And then they were like, oh, and then obviously the only one they didn't tell me about, because I think this was the last move, was they got Steelback. So Steelback wasn't even considered a good AD carrying challenger. So I remember, this is the infamous one, Loco. This is probably one of my all-time, like, it's an ultimate wreckage moment, because since I knew all this stuff, and I knew that, as Deficio says, you're Fnatic, you're supposed to be able to get all the big free agents, you're supposed to be able to put a lineup together where you don't have to gamble on, a rookie or something. You just get like the best players and you try and win the split again. So because they'd basically gotten all these rookies, and then Yellow Star, who for context wasn't even obviously traditionally a support player.
He was on his way out.
Yeah, and had thought about retiring, by the way. It was another thing during the off-season. They were like, we don't even know if Yellow Star's here. And then, so when they got him, and he wasn't really like a laning support. He was more known for roaming, helping synergize with Reckless, who was somewhat passive in lane. So I thought, right, there's no way this can work. So infamously, I made a video, Loco, and the title of the video was Fnatic Lost the Off-Season. Now, obviously, turned out they didn't in the end. They won the split. They went on next split. They 18-0'd when they got Reckless back into the team. The prodigal son returned, begged forgiveness, was allowed back into, and obviously became a fantastic player again.
Please let me in.
Yeah. And then obviously, they did the 18-0 with him in the lineup and won.
It's actually crazy to think about a world where Steelback, let's say it hadn't been Steelback, it had been another AD carry, like a more well-known AD carry who actually had been, let's say, pretty good. We could have taken Taps who
there's plenty of people, right? Freeze,
right.
Forgiven, there's plenty of players. Yeah,
some of these guys, like if they had joined the Fnatic in spring, they probably would have done the same. You know, they would have won the split. They would have gone to MSI, probably done close to the same at MSI. I'm not sure if they would have taken Reckless back then. And
they would. Really? It's Reckles. He's like the EU player.
If you have Forgiven right there, like ignoring anything about Synergy or whatever, if you have Forgiven in that Fnatic lineup and you just won the spring split, you just did well at MSI, I don't know. I can see a world where they would say, no, we love our lineup already. Like we have what we need to win the summer split as well.
I actually have a perfect example for this. When TSM played with Turtle is a longtime friend of TSM, and they won the split. They still took Doublelift back because even if that TSM was good, they knew they'd be better with Double. I think Fnatic management would make the same decision. Reckles is hella young. He's shown a lot of success before.
Sure.
And he is one of the most popular players in Europe, barring like Froggen and Peke. With Origen on the rise, I think even at that moment, the logical decision would have been to take Reckles, even with like him dumping Fnatic for a split.
Yeah, I can just see a different scenario, you know, where it didn't actually happen, and he was stuck on Elements for another split because he made the decision to leave Fnatic. He didn't get kicked. He left Fnatic on his own to say, Alliance or Elements, they will be the better team.
Yes.
I can go to Worlds with these guys, and I can't perform with these. Like, this is the super team in Europe with Froggen in there. But it always ended up completely backfiring. And again, it was in the same story. I feel like, well, in Europe, we always see this where old names, they peak, and then they can very quickly disappear. Or at least they become, you know, below average teams or players. I think only Source is the example of a guy who's maintained that level ever since Season 1. But because we had this new 2015 Europe, we also got, of course, Origen. And with Fnatic splitting up originally, Soas, Peke, Cyanide, all these guys leaving, you get Peke's dream project. He gets to create his own organization. They're living in Spain, and they get Mythy, who was just banned in Season 4, so he didn't get to play professionally. And when he wasn't banned, he was stuck in Challenge on NIP and couldn't qualify for the LCS because he would lose every promo tournament. But they just couldn't perform. Simple as that. And they have Source Peke, and of course, the most important thing for me is they had this guy called Nils HD.
Yes.
Or Sven, as he became after that. 17-year-old Danish AD carry.
New Reckles.
Basically new Reckles, who, funnily enough, I used to play against in small, tiny LAN events in Denmark years ago when he was like 14 years old, and he was a cocky kid, and I hated his team because they would always trash talk, but we would always beat them. Then we made the LCS with Copenhagen Wolves and so on, and he was just stuck there with players like Jesses as well, and Cold or Trashy, but he gets on this lineup, and I remember looking at it being like, I know this kid. He's not that good. He didn't do anything when I played him back in the day. And little did I know that when I watched him play in Challenger, he was insane. When he makes it onto LCS in the summer split, in one of the first games he plays Vayne. He like makes a sick play up in the top lane where he dances in out of everything. I think he did it on Kalista too. Like, the guy just made some sick moves. And him and Mythy, to me, almost instantly became the best bot lane in Europe. And probably the best bot lane we've ever had and will ever have, at least in the foreseeable future, because Mythy had mechanics back then. This isn't current Mythy. You know, this is a playmaker Mythy who was famous with stuff like Thresh. And then you have Sven, who is mechanically insane as an AD carry. And you get this Origen lineup that always had the win condition of late game because they had Sven. And Peke, famously at Worlds, would just pick wave clear champions, like, you know,
this is not the Xpeke of old.
This was not the Z Xpeke. Soas was still one of the most criticized players ever because he would be the guy to go 0-5 in lane in one game and get flamed. Then the next game he would play like a god, even though he got no resources, and he would play almost anything. But he didn't need to do a whole lot in the early game. And then they had Amazing as the jungler. And Amazing had returned from TSM, where he obviously was trying to play Lee Sin and Elise and that kind of stuff.
Eve.
And Eve, and then on Origen, he had to just play tanks and he had to just play safe. So him and Mythy were just like communicating defensive vision, and trying to predict the moves of the other teams during Worlds, and then they would just set up team fights. They went back to running TP mid, which people didn't do. It kind of disappeared the double teleport, but they ran TP mid on Peke every game, so he could always just be safe in lane. He could never lose lane because he was on wave clear plus TP, and then they would get to the point where Sven had a couple of items, and they would just team fight. And it was so effective, especially because in groups they ended up getting one of the toughest
the ultimate group
get.
for death.
Yeah, like LGD was hyped up as one of the best teams in the world going into Worlds, but they lost.
They got literally the number 1 Chinese team, LGD, and then the number 2 Korean team, KT Rolston. Now on paper, if you get number 1 Chinese, number 2, that should be like, you should be out of that group. You're not getting out of that one.
And TSM.
There was also a team called TSM there.
Oh yeah, I guess
not really that relevant, But.
So,
well, to be fair, that is still my favourite part of Season 5 Worlds. It's not even any of the matches. It's just that video where Loco and Reginald are watching the draw, and they don't know how like the regional thing passed, so they think they got in the good group, and they're like, yeah, and then they realise on the screen, it's almost like it was set up like a movie, because on the screen it shows but of course they can't go into that group because of the regional thing, and they're like, wait a minute, what? And then they just see themselves get put in the group of death.
Didn't we also have a video before MSI?
Yes. Crash and burn. Yes.
Wait. Let me defend myself.
Come on.
I watched European finals, and it was a shit show. And Fnatic improved so much from the finals to MSI. At MSI, they definitely improved.
Sure.
If they played like they did in finals, they would have gotten dumpster fired.
Dude, it was
Plus, to be fair, I will give credit to Loco. The time that he said that was like when TSM was at their peak. They'd just won that IEM, they'd won the split. It was pretty sweet. It was good timing to be able to say
guys, this is a European episode. Let's stick to European topics.
Okay, you are correct. Anyway, so Origen Group of Death didn't really know what to expect from them after. So we had high hopes before the group draw. Because I'm like, your Origen, they're legit. They took Fnatic, who 18-0'd their summer split, to 5 games in the best final we've ever had in EU LCS. And like in Stockholm, Reckless Pentakill, Xpek and Source versus their old team, Sven kind of challenging Reckless for best AD carry in Europe. Like all the stuff is there. Sorry, forgiven, by the way. It was all there. And we get these 5 games. Fnatic win in the end, which was the best because they deserved to win everything. And the whole story of Daylor and Hootie and Reyno was just fantastic. But when Origen got that group, I remember just being like, okay, this team, they're going to be okay, but they're never going to win. Because I thought LGG would win Worlds, like coming into it. Or at least they would like get to the final. Sure. And I feel like LGD would be able to match Origen in the late game. Because they had like, Imp as the AD carry and good old Godvi in the mid lane. So I'm like, this team can match anything Origen wants to do, but Origen just fucking shat on them in team fights, especially the famous Xpek 4-man Shockwave in the mid lane, and then where Imp, I think, has flash and everything, he gets Shockwaved anyway on Karkmore, he dies, Origen kind of get back in the game, and they take down LGD, they obviously get out of groups as... I believe it was as second seed.
Yeah.
But then, because Flash Wolves
They got the nicest group draw ever. You come second in a group of death, and you end up getting Flash Wolves when Coup Tigers was in their group. That's pretty nice
Flash
draw.
Wolves had surprised everyone and gotten first by beating Coup Tigers in Group A. And there's the famous Sven gif where he's like dancing when he sees that they're getting Flash Wolves.
Yeah, understandable.
And they obviously beat them as well, which was no surprise. And they actually get, top 4. Sadly for them, while they were really good, they were not close to Coup Tigers.
That's where the draw got bad again. No, it was SK Telecom they got.
Oh, sorry, SKT, yeah.
Yes, so that's the problem, is they got the team that lost one game in the whole tournament, whereas at least Fnatic got Coup Tigers, which people was a chance for.
When you're in semis, there are no good draws.
I mean, they could have drawn Fnatic. There's a world where that could have happened.
I guess that could...
Actually, I think at that point, it probably was locked in.
The seeding didn't allow them, right?
Yeah, I think the seeding guaranteed it was going to be...
They were on opposite sides of the bracket,
Yeah, exactly. So that was it. But obviously, switching over to Fnatic then, the European hope, and I can safely say for all European fans, especially all the loud Fnatic fans, this was the kind of team where people actually believed they could win Worlds. Not the case in Season 3, definitely not the case in Season 4. But Season 5, I think, But Season 5, that Fnatic lineup with Huni on carry top laners, Reckless on utility, 80 carries, even Kennen played as utility because he provided a stun, not as a split pusher, but as a utility pick. And Febiven at MSI solo killing Faker twice. People were saying like, this is it. I believe this Fnatic team would make the final as well. Like, I felt like they had so many tools. The problem was this Fnatic lineup was too focused on Huni. It was too much about
too
Huni.
one-dimensional.
It was not a triple threat team, and they ended up playing against SMEP and the Coup Tigers, and Coup Tigers could obviously match Huni.
So I want to say one thing. So Daler was a really, really great coach, but one thing he was really bad at was game knowledge, and a lot of his game knowledge he got from the players themselves. And I remember talking to Daler at MSI before and after. Before conversation, I was extremely cocky. I was like, who is this guy? And then after conversation, I wanted to learn from him. One thing that he said was, your team didn't recognize like how important top lane is and how crucial it is to play the top lane. While all that was true, I think their belief on how important it was to play the top lane, because Reckles and Yellowstar were very resource free and Huni was resource hungry, it was so black and white, where they didn't understand it. They didn't understand the map completely. They just understood that part of the game, and they only played that part of the game. And also, Coup Tigers were better about playing topside anyways with Smep.
Yeah, and that was kind of the problem, right? Because Coup Tigers ended up having the better bot lane with Prey and Gorilla, just naturally 2v2 the better bot lane. They could match Febiven in the mid lane, and then all they needed to succeed was Smep just don't lose top lane. He then ended up even winning top lane on his own, because Huni obviously, we had the Riven versus Hecarim 1v1 where Huni loses on Riven, and Hecarim was kind of the counter pick to it. Then he picks the opposite matchup where he's now playing the Hecarim against Smep's Riven, and he also loses that one. I might have swapped them around there, but I seem to remember that was the matchup up top lane. And that was kind of the moment where you could just see this team is getting outclassed. I will still say, though, game 1, Fnatic had so many things going for them. They were really far ahead in the early game, but then they set up the worst bot lane tower dive with Rainova on Rek'Sai, where he ends up flashing back in under the turret. After the play is kind of already over, he dies. Coup Tigers kind of run over Fnatic and get a bunch of kills, and the entire early game goal lead just disappears.
And they weren't good at bot dives. They were really good at top dives, but they weren't very experienced regarding playing around bot.
But that Fnatic team had so many ways to play as long as Huni won, because then they could do anything. And because Huni was insane.
Team fight,
yeah, they could run 3-1, and Rainova understood, because he had natural synergy as well with Huni, just play to that side. Everyone else don't need to do anything. Play top lane, play top lane, play top lane. And it was so predictable, but Huni, against most top laners in the world, was able to do this. And the other thing about Season 5 Worlds was European teams were the best at lane swaps. And every team ended up adapting to the European lane swap during the boot camp, or at least the good teams. So like SKT kind of picked up the European lane swap and understood it. But the Chinese teams didn't understand the European lane swap whatsoever. So what happened when Fnatic in the very first game of groups played against IG, funny enough, the same kind of matchup we're going to get this year, they lane swapped, and IG were just so clueless, because this was back when your top laner ideally was sitting on almost no CS early on while you were swapping, and you would then, when as an AD carry and support, when you killed the turret, you had to make sure it would bounce back to you, the minion wave, so that your top laner could go to that lane and pick up a big wave that was pushing to him, so you could pick it up safely and not have the lane push. And IG didn't get that. So IG's bot lane, when they killed the turret, they just pushed the lane, which meant when Zitai ended up going to the lane and they became the 1v1, Huni was like 3 levels above him with like a massive CS lead, and Zitai couldn't do anything. He was pushed out in lane, he got ganked by Reno, he dies, and IG just fall apart. And Fnatic win in 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. So the European lane swap ended up being a huge benefit for them. But obviously it actually ended up also being the meta for Korean teams, because they learned and kind of perfected the same lane swap. You can probably remember the SKT EDG game that happened, where it was also lane swap by SKT, and EDG messed up everything and like lost in 20 minutes.
I honestly, I don't remember much from that tournament. After losing, I just being emo as hell and like wanting to get out of Paris. That's what I remember.
Well, the last team Europe sent was H2K. H2K was in groups with EDG and SKT.
Rip.
And SKT and EDG decided to punch H2K in the face. H2K managed to win one game. They got Mordekaiser on the Juggernaut patch. And Mordekaiser obviously was insanely broken and had like 100% ban rate before that. They won that game and they went 1-5, if I remember 100% correctly. And that was it. But that was the H2K lineup with Yarnin as the AD carry.
Yes, well, this obviously connects to the next one, Season 6, because the thing about that H2K is, I think that I thought of them as more in line with the SK lineup that was the Jesus one, etc., where again, you've got like some quality coaching, like decent group of people, but not many big star players, you know, you're obviously lacking them. Then you come to Season 6, though, they obviously upgraded, they got Forgiven, they had Yankos as their jungler, they got Vander, so they made this very strong team. Famously, they didn't win any of the splits, though, because they had this whole drama with, like, Forgiven, and then he went out of the team and came back later. But they ended up going to Worlds. Obviously, they ended up finishing top 4 at Season 6 Worlds. The other teams from Europe, you had the G2 team that won both the splits, where, again, they had their own roster move because they obviously had Kikis when they started out and a different bot lane for Spring Split. Then they had the Vacation, and then they got Sven and Mithi, and they got Expect as the top laner. So they won the splits, and then the third team from Europe was from the Gauntlet. We had the Splice team, the all-Danish lineup, Sencooks, Trashy, etc., coming through. And then, if people remember, the Worlds draw was Splice basically got the equivalent of the Origin draw. They got like the super hard group where it's like you're the wild card, and so you shouldn't really have any chance. H2K got one of the easier group draws because they had no Korean team, crucially, and they managed to do that epic run back against EDG. And then G2 was in the group where people often forget this part. When everyone talks mad shit on like ANX, who were they? They're only the team that beat Rocks Tigers and was wrecking G2, and CLG was in the group. So, you know, this was actually a group that had some decent parity. But yes, on paper, G2 fucked up big time by not getting out of the group.
Yes, especially because where we had the kind of Fnatic dominance before, they'd won every split except for the one against Season 4 Summer where Alliance won. And Fnatic had the Huni Reignover lineup, the 18-0. Like, everyone loved Fnatic. It was just Fnatic. That was all people cared about in Europe. And then Origen entered, and people then cared about Fnatic and Origen. So it didn't feel like there was actually room for another top team, which in a way kind of ended up hurting G2 and their reputation. But when Season 6 started, we once again had a bunch of players leaving, obviously going over to North America. Huni and Reignover disappeared, so this whole Fnatic lineup kind of crashed and burned because they picked up Gamsu and Spirit, and Reckless was now supposed to be the captain and the leader. And this is actually when I remember you made videos, Thorin, talking about, you know, the passive utility Reckless style from Season 5 was never going to function as the main carry on this Fnatic lineup, and it ended up being very true. He had to kind of try and change his style to be more of a carry like in Season 4. So Fnatic kind of took a step down without anyone in Europe actually doing anything against him. It was all North America just taking Huni Reignover away from them, and Yellowstar as well ended up, you know,
on TSM.
Not playing because he was on TSM, and it was Cly or Noxiac first, and then it was Cly who became the support. So Fnatic was a mess. Origen picked up Power of Evil. Expected wanted to play less. Power of Evil was supposed to be the new hot stuff. He came from Unicorns of Love, where he'd done really well individually. Everything else was the same, but it was a bunch of old players, and then Power of Evil plus Sven, where it was very clear the motivation and the drive in the regular season wasn't there. So they did really poorly for most of the spring split. And then G2 entered. Promo tournament, they win. They make instant roster changes. Kikis is a top laner now out of nowhere. They pick up Trick, who was not considered anything. He'd played just a couple of games in OGN and done almost nothing with them. And then they had Emperor, who was definitely not in his prime.
Yeah.
When he had just come from like Brazil or something. He played in North America, that's right, yeah.
He was nothing, but he also did like Brazil. I think he came from Brazil actually.
He was Brazil and then he did TDK.
Yeah, G2 just picked over some leftover players.
Yes, exactly.
These were not premier players.
But they had perks. And it's another great chapter of European mid laners. 17-year-old, cocky as hell, had tried to qualify to the LCS already, but failed. So people didn't really hold him at high regards. It was just like, yeah, this guy's okay. Enters LCS. Him and Trick from day one, like best buddies in terms of how to play. Everyone in Europe at the point tried to play slow. It was like, yeah, we need scaling, we need farming, blah, blah, blah. G2 were like, LeBlanc Graves, let's go. And they just ran people down, like all of Spring Split. And they win the split. Perks and Trick, like Trick is MVP, Perks is Rookie of the Split. It's just all about these two guys. Everyone else is just a support on it. And that's when G2 realized, in order to actually in order to maintain, this core of Perks and Trick, and to maintain the number one spot in Europe, they needed to upgrade certain roles. So when Sven and Mithy was available, after Origen had kind of had a really poor regular season and then lost the final to G2, Carlos famously, obviously, strikes, picks up Sven and Mithy, does it doing MSI, which is why Emperor and Hybrid doing MSI obviously get told...
We're on vacation in Korea and all the rest of it, yeah.
You just get told you're getting benched by like doing the whole tournament. It was a giant mess. G2 makes the famous statement, vacation memes, blah, blah, blah. And it's just like Europe just... After we had Fnatic Origen, top 4 at Worlds, we get G2 shitting the bed at MSI, losing every game they're playing except for the wildcard team, and like
they even lost one to them, I think, didn't they? Didn't they lose to Supermassive as well?
They went 1-9. They went 1-9. Like everyone hated them. It was insane. But anyway, they get Sven and Mithy. They obviously win the summer split because this G2 lineup is just unstoppable in Europe. Expect joins, and he joins because Kigis was a tank only player, and Expect was like this mechanically gifted player, and they wanted like the difference, and they could try and work with Expect. Kigis obviously famously just leaves.
Ultimatum.
Like, he's like, I don't want to sub. So, and then he's gone, and it's just Expect in the top lane. That was the weakness of G2. That Expect, while he was mechanically good, he had no clue what the fuck to do. Like he had no clue about macro knowledge, and he needed to constantly get kind of guided around by Mithy. But that G2 lineup, when they entered Worlds in Season 6, to me, they should have been able to go into a quarterfinal and go toe-to-toe against almost anyone except for maybe like the best Korean teams. But any Chinese teams, any NA team, this G2 lineup should be able to go toe-to-toe with them, maybe even beat them, and actually be able to go far. And I hyped them up like left and right. I remember going to the boot camp with the casters just being like, this G2 lineup, dude, these guys, like Sven and Myth, Perks, Trick, double MVP, this is insane. These guys are so good. I see the group draw. I'm like running around my underwear screaming that this is the greatest thing I've ever seen. CLG was not considered a good team.
No, they got there from circuit points. They got boosted by TSM winning, if you remember, yeah.
They had everything to at least get out of groups, and they lose the first game they play against CLG where Xmithy picks Olaf. And Pobuilder and Xmithy, like they force like flash from Perks, and then they kill Perks after, and then they go bot lane, they kill Sven, and G2 just fall apart. Like they just fall apart and lose, and then they lose to Albus Nox Luna the next game. They lose to Rox Tigers despite winning the early game. Like everything just went completely downhill, and I still remember seeing these players after, knowing that you failed at MSI as G2 Esports, especially Perks. You were hyped up as being the next big EU mid laner, a lot of pressure on you. You then go to Worlds, you play really poorly at Worlds individually, like Perks had a horrible tournament. The team loses, and everyone flames G2. Like everything is just back to MSI. And seeing these players like break down and just like, cry and everything, just realize that this was such an easy group to play in.
Yes.
But they were just a terrible best of one team, first of all, and then with the pressure they already had from the community, because people wanted Fnatic. But Fnatic, they sucked. They didn't even go to Worlds. And they got G2. And G2 failed everyone. Splice obviously couldn't get out of their group. They got 1-1 against TSM, I believe.
We don't have to talk about Splice that much.
They got 0-2. They should have been beating TSM, but they got 0-2, but they beat RNG. They like stomp RNG in like 25 minutes in one game for some reason. Yeah. And all of Europe had kind of just given up on Worlds until H2K actually ended up winning their group, looking really good, with something I never expected to be one of the main win conditions: Odo Amne on carries. He was insane during Worlds, and they had this style because the team didn't function, right? It was a bunch of players who knew that they were individually very gifted, but they didn't work well together, like whatsoever. Forgiven bot lane with Vander, as Thorin said before, Jankos and Odoamne playing to top side, and the entire strategy was win lane, win game. Ryu was of course the mid laner as well, and all they tried to do was counter pick top, early game jungler, strong bot lane with like Caitlyn, Karma, these kind of things, and just perma push every lane, and Jankos would invade and gank everything he could ever get close to. And that style in best of one against EDG, fantastic, by the way, because Klilov is just like, he doesn't know what's happening. He just got ran over completely, and like EDG couldn't do anything. And H2K make it out as a first seed, get Albus Nox Luna in the quarterfinal, and then obviously go on to play Samsung in the semifinal, and then get 3-0'd. But I think H2K win lane, win game has almost never been a style Europe has played, unless we go back to Moscow 5 days in Season 2. But they actually, in a different way, obviously, because they had a super strong bot lane and they had a super strong carry top that they were kind of playing around. But we got like peak Forgiven killing turrets at 6 minutes. We got peak Odoamne playing Jace and Kennen and like stomping top lane. And I don't know where that Odoamne is now, but I want him back, because to me that was like the best tournament he's ever played. And that H3K lineup, I know people will say they were not a top 4 team in the world and they got the easiest possible quarterfinal ever, but I would have loved to see this H3K lineup against some of the other non-Korean teams.
Yes.
In a best of 5.
Yeah, that's the real what if on that one, because obviously that's the thing, you want to know how good they were. So yeah, would it obviously, like, this is the part people miss, is that since they got number 2 out of Group 1, well, that could have been G2, that could have been CLG. Yep. They also actually could have drawn Cloud9, they could have gotten them in the quarterfinals. So those would have been the matchups that would have shown us, because that's best of 5 play, you know, if they were actually really good. Whereas, yeah, they obviously got like the wild card, and if you can get a wild card in a World's quarterfinals, you probably should go to the semifinals. And
then because they got 3-0 in the semis, despite actually having game 1 and 2, where it was kind of where for me the old Jankos story of him always choking when it matters, it kind of died during Worlds, because he played really well. He was going ham in some of those games early. Oh my god, he was like solo carrying the early game against Samsung in game 1 and 2, and like he was like 6-0 up and everything, but the team obviously past 20 minutes had no clue what to do. Yes. They couldn't play around Baron, they couldn't really team fight, so it just fell apart and they got 3-0, and that was another reason for why people said, well, did they really deserve top 4? I think they did everything they were supposed to do, and they got to the semis. Obviously, Season 7 in Europe was actually quite an unusual one, because if people remember, the quick version is G2 wins the splits again. But actually the way they did it was quite interesting, because in the spring split, sure, they were still a very good team. The summer split was the one where famously, like, they actually almost lost to, I think it was the Splice team. Yeah, they had like a really epic quarterfinal, and then, you know, people thought actually that Fnatic, who'd gotten better and better as the splits went on, in the summer, people actually thought that Fnatic was going to win that split, but they didn't even win against Misfits in the semi-finals. And so we ended up with G2 going first place. We had the Fnatic squad go, and then obviously we had this Misfits team come on late, who hadn't been that good even earlier in the year, managed to go to Worlds, and obviously this was a Worlds with I'd say quite a lot of upsets, but obviously pretty good for Europe. A couple of teams making the playoffs. What was Season 7 like, Deficio? Again, like I say, a lot of turnover in that sense. Yeah. And the return of Fnatic. Season 7 ended up being a pretty good year for Europe. It obviously, as you said, in spring, we had Fnatic. They got rid of Spirit and Gamsu. It didn't work for the team whatsoever. And Febiven. And Febiven, who he ended up joining H2K. But Fnatic kind of rebuilt, and it became a European Fnatic lineup we got to see. And the biggest change for them was the fact that they got this new mid laner. Yes. 17-year-old kid who had just won the Turkish league. His name is Caps. And I already remember getting excited pre-season because I was talking to the players about, this new guy. Who is he? What should I know? And every single person just told me, this guy in scrims wins every lane. Like, he is mechanically insane. And the pro players called him Baby Faker. We tried to call him that on broadcast. It didn't work really well. But he was basically, like, in the pro scene, being talked about like this new up-and-coming EU mid that could just be insane. And the Fnatic lineup was actually built by Nico the Pico, and he's come out later and talked about how the entire goal of that Fnatic lineup was just like play around caps. Just do everything you can do to play around caps no matter what, because this guy will just win you games. Now, it didn't work super well in the start because, first of all, they actually ended up putting caps on a lot of like Victor and that kind of stuff. But they learned in the spring split of 2017 that they didn't need to play traditional League of Legends. They didn't have to play slow League of Legends, and they started like inventing all these new play styles. Most of them were not focused on caps at all. It was actually focused on Reckless, who would really kind of become actually a great carry again, despite his very rough 2016. And they kind of invented like lane swaps that people didn't expect, where they played like Annie Twitch, and they would like sit in the top lane brush, wait for the top laner to show up, kill the top laner, then they would crash the wave into the turret, but they couldn't kill the turret because Riot had obviously made the changes to lane swaps back then, so they couldn't kill it. They just crashed it into the turret. The enemy top laner would return, they would kill the top laner again and give both kills to Reckless, and then he would recall and go bot lane, and he would like show up with like an experience advantage and whatever, and he could like, just win his lane like that. And the lineup was Soas in the top lane.
Returning to Fnatic.
Returning to Fnatic. We had Amazing first in the jungle, but he quickly got replaced by Broxa from the academy team. Then
similar scenario to the Kickers example from the previous year with G2, because they just wanted Amazing to sub, and then he also kind of took offense to that and like basically left the squad.
Yeah, a lot of stuff happened internally right there. I think not a lot of it made it to the public, but in a way, Amazing is out, Broxa plays, and then Jessis was the support. And the Jessis story is always kind of weird because he was originally an AD carry when he made it into LCS. Then he got instantly benched because he was on... he was originally an AD carry before LCS. He then became a mid laner in LCS on SK Gaming. He then got out of the LCS, became an AD carry again on G2 Esports. When they made LCS, got benched before they got to play a game with him in the LCS. He then became a coach for Immortals. And then he returned now as a support for Fnatic. So he's like gone.
Oh wait, wasn't it Misfits he was a coach of?
No, he was coach on Immortals.
Immortals. He was in North America coaching.
Okay.
And that's when he then went to Korea and practiced solo queue just as a support, and he made like, I think, Challenger as a support or something, and I think that was enough to impress Fnatic. He ended up then joining Fnatic and play with Reckless, so that was the lineup. And they actually, after they figured out how to play just around Reckless with these like, really creative Kennen AD carry, Twitch AD carry, these kind of weird play styles, they ended up looking pretty good. They couldn't beat G2. We had a pretty insane semifinal between Fnatic and G2 in spring, where Fnatic win game 1, and they're really far ahead in game 2 as well with this with Annie support, which no one played at the time. But then they throw in the late game up like 10k gold, they lose. G2 start banning out some of the cheese picks, and then G2 just kind of run over them, a classic G2 style of like, we are the best macro team in Europe. And G2 go to the final, beat Unicorns, boring final, win the split. But Fnatic obviously in summer split actually knocked G2 out of first place, because we had the double group system, and Fnatic and G2 were in the same group. And Fnatic got first place in the regular season, which meant they went straight to semifinal, which is why G2 had to play for the first time ever the quarterfinal against Splice. And that was the quarterfinal where Splice they had fired their coach, their manager was on stage, and they'd picked up, without anyone knowing, Crepo as the coach.
The secret coach.
The Boris, as they called him. And with him, they prepared so much for that best of 5 with the Splice team, that they came in with like game 1 they had the Camille Galio strategy that people didn't really play, and then Morgana with Black Shield. So it was like you would Black Shield the Camille, So she would jump in with ulti, and then Galio would ulti on top of that, and you would just kill the AD carry every time. And G2 couldn't deal with it, and lost game 1. And Senkuk's played the best series of his life. So in the end, Splice almost knocked them out, which would have been insane. But G2 go on to beat Misfits, who had obviously surprised everyone. It's very briefly, Misfits spring split, they had Kakao as the jungler.
Really?
Alfar top lane, Kakao, who they picked up from when they were boot camping in Korea after they qualified for LCS. And then they had in the mid lane Power of Evil, and they had in the bot lane Hansama and Ignar. So double Koreans and a bunch of new players, and then Power of Evil. Hansama was a very hyped up rookie together with Alfari. A lot of people will remember LS, like kind of praising Alfari from Korean solo queue and talking about how this guy is like thinking on a like a Korean level instead of like a traditional Western level, like all that kind of stuff. So the lineup had a really good start to spring. Then everyone figured out how to play against them, which was ban, Lee Sin, and then Kakao was useless. Kakao was insane the first couple of weeks and then was complete garbage for the rest. And the team sadly got knocked out very quickly. And couldn't really do anything in spring. But in summer, they benched Kakao, bought Maxlaw, who ended up being probably the best player they could ever get because he's extremely smart, very vocal, and he's also able to play a lot of different styles. So Misfits, the reason they beat Fnatic in the semifinals because Misfits were better at preparing than Fnatic. Fnatic was still, coaching-wise, all over the place. Like, Dylan was the only guy there coaching from what I remember, and it was still very much a player-driven kind of setup. So it didn't feel like they really were preparing too much towards whoever they were playing, and they were just kind of playing their style. And Misfits just said, well, they will never gank mid early. Caps will always play aggressive, and we just go mid in the early game. And Maxlaw and Power of Evil ganked the mid lane like 5 times each game. Kill Caps every time. Fnatic couldn't play their 1-3-1 or couldn't play their split pushing AD carry style and just crashed. And it was actually the same thing that happened at Rift Rivals, very famously, where NA won Rift Rivals in Europe by abusing the mid lane. And Misfits went back to that style in playoffs, beat Fnatic, makes the final, but they were just a weaker version of G2, so they could never actually beat G2, and it was a 3-0 final. So that's kind of the setup of what happened during the regular season and playoffs. But we entered Worlds with G2 being hyped up again by certain analysts, maybe myself, but the fans not believing in G2 too much. But they had just come off the MSI run where they made the final and lost 3-1 to SKT, so there was a bit more faith in this G2 team. You had Misfits, complete wildcard. No one had any expectations whatsoever. And then Fnatic, who had gotten better during the split, but then obviously got 3-0 or 3-1 by Misfits. So people wanted Fnatic to be good, and Fnatic got a really good group where they had Immortals, Gigabyte Marines, and then it was Longju in there. So it was like they can get second place here.
Yes.
And they did.
Remember,
that was the weird part, if you remember, about Worlds, is that on the one hand, so the clear best team from Europe by the end was G2. Now, G2 got, unfortunately, a group that had Royal Never Give Up and Samsung Galaxy in it, so they didn't get out, and that's actually a group on paper you shouldn't. Fnatic, as you say, had a group that looked like this is the best chance for Europe, but if you remember, week 1, they actually were kind of shitty, and then they sort of had to come on strong second week. And then the last one, Misfits, by all rights, they shouldn't be getting out their group. They basically got the equivalent of what Splice got the year before. It's like, you've got all these good teams. It's fine if you lose here, but amazingly make it out of the group. So expectations defied.
Well, that was the thing, right? Because the Misfits group was World Elite, who came through play-ins as the Chinese third seed, and it was Flash Wolves, and then it was TSM. And it was obviously one of the years where TSM was really hyped. And it was like, oh, this is it. TSM finally get an easy group. They have to deal with the Chinese third seed. They have to deal with Flash Wolves, who had not looked that great during Worlds the year before and didn't look great during MSI the same year. It was when TSM and Flash Wolves ended up having a tiebreaker as well for the last playoff spot. So, and then it was Misfits, who was not considered a strong team from Europe and kind of like a wild card, basically. So this was supposed to be the TSM group, but obviously what ended up happening was Misfits go 3-3, and then they have the tiebreaker game where they beat TSM, and they stop TSM from getting out of groups, and they advance as the second seed. We get like so many epic games out of this Misfits lineup because it was the Ardent Sensor meta, and everything seemed to be locked in stone in terms of how you had to play bot lane.
Yes.
Until Ignar is like against, all odds. He's like, he has Blitzcrank, he has Fervor of Battle Leona, like these insane picks that no one else would play. And the
and
team,
in a quarterfinal of the Worlds as well, no less.
It was nuts. Like, also, even in groups, they had some specific strategies they used. Like, one of them they used against TSM, where they also ran Yasuo top lane for Alphari, and like they had like so many different ideas, and they were really creative. And Hussein Mousvi, the coach, to me is one of the greatest coaches we've had in Europe, because he really understood how to prepare for teams and identify their weaknesses. And that's what he did against SKT as well in that famous quarterfinal, where that was the World's run where SKT's bot lane was a huge issue.
Mm-hmm.
Bang and Wolf were just not performing whatsoever. So instead of saying, let's play a passive bot lane versus Bang and Wolf and just trade even and try and win mid lane against Faker, it was like, why don't we just abuse these guys? Like, legit give them the standard range supports and just pick heavy kill lanes against it. Pick early game junglers that can gank and just try and punish it super hard. And the entire goal was obviously win bot lane and then unleash Ignar to just roam everywhere. And Faker had to try and 1v9 the entire series, but his teammates would just die left and right. And we even had like Ignar getting the Blitzcrank hook onto Faker on his Corki, and like where he flash hooks him and kills him, and that kind of seals the deal. And I will never forget Game 4. I will never forget the fact that Misfits are winning this game. So it wasn't even like 2 cheese games and then getting stumped. It was because that was the Game 4 was a more standard draft. They had like Sivir 80 carry and so on. It was pretty standard.
This was a legit game.
It was a legit game, and they're outplaying SKT. They get to the mid-inhib turret. Huni's on Trundle top lane, and they all in onto Huni. SKT is there to tower dive him. Huni's on like 40 HP when he gets his ulti off on Trundle, and he heals up like massively, and he stays alive because he gets all the protection. SKT then under that turret kill Misfits, win the fight, and then go on to get back in that game. 40 HP. Had Huni died right there, that tower dive would just have ran over SKT. Misfits had the game. Like, that was a 3-1 Misfits series.
Man.
And it
both
was
you and Jad love doing what if TSM did this? What if Double F didn't dash in? What if
at least mine are like realistic and things that could actually happen. We're talking 40 HP. Like, this is not a what if Misfits played better or anything.
Yes.
They did everything they were supposed to do. Anyway, so they lose. That's a Misfits story. Goddamn, I love them. What a fantastic team to watch. But Fnatic, the other famous story of miracle runs.
That World was so fun to watch for Europe. It was incredibly fun to watch.
Week 1 was not fun to watch whatsoever. No. Like, I was on suicide watch. I was like,
the up and down of that World was so good.
Yeah, it was nuts. Like, they were 0-3 after week 1. They lost to TL, also to Immortals, because Reckless played Twitch, and he had like carried the entire game, and then like at 40 minutes or something, he sneaks up to Builder, who sits with an hourglass, and he opens up alone. Builder just clicks hourglass, and all of Immortals just kill Reckless, and like they win the game. And it was doomed. It was also the famous Nocturne jungle from Levi, where he hits level 6 like way earlier than we've ever seen before, and he like ults down bot lane and kills Jesters and Reckless, and like Gigabyte Marines just ran over them. So this Fnatic team, it was over. And they even lose the first game they play in week 2. So they're 0-4. But that's when they beat Gigabyte Marines. The famous Cody Sun moment happens for Immortals, where he knocks in Caps into his own team, and Caps kills them. And even before that, actually, Cody Sun's play was bad, but Immortals' play before that was awful as well. They tried to like tower dive Source on a tank, took like 10 million tower shots on Flame. He dies, and then Fnatic just runs them down and like win, even though Fnatic were behind in that series. And then they obviously win the tiebreaker as well to move on. It was never supposed to happen, but it was multiple tiebreakers, wasn't it? Or at least it was like multiple games that it must-win games for Fnatic.
They had to basically just win out. Just win
everything.
All the rest of the games, yeah. Soaz was like, a fucking baller in this world as well. Playing all the dog champs.
Yeah.
Dog champ.
He ends up having huge plays gained by Marines where they beat them after they were also supposed to lose that game. But to be fair, like from an outside perspective, like that Fnatic lineup, it felt like playing around reckless as they tried to do with all these kind of unique AD carries, kind of limited everyone else. And Caps, this is one of the reasons the hype around Caps didn't take off during 2017, because he didn't get any resources. He didn't get any help. It was never go mid. It was always go top lane at level 4, pull off one gank, and then just go bot lane. Just go bot lane all the time. So Caps, while he was good, he was a young player who didn't know what to do properly on the map. No one really guided him around, and they didn't play towards him. So people didn't realize actually how insane he already could be in 2017. And Caps, and the reason I highlight this is because that kind of becomes the big story of 2018, not just for Fnatic, but actually for all of Europe right now. The last part to touch on is, of course, G2. Tough group, RNG, Samsung. They go 1-1 against RNG, I believe it is. And they lose the first game to Samsung, but the second game they're beating Samsung. And if Samsung lost that game, they would not have made it out of groups.
Yes.
Because they'd lost to, I'm going to trigger some people here, to 1907 Fenerbahce. Before that, in that game where they subbed out Ambition.
Yep.
And then the team just looked so terrible, and they lost in like 40-minute Clown Fiesta game. But G2 obviously ends up being just worse in the late game, and they lose the game. And they don't make it up, but they actually played really well. So I'm kind of sad for them. But yeah, the what-if scenario of they beaten Samsung there and knocked them out. Who's the world champion? SKT, I guess?
Longju, maybe?
Longju,
SKT or RNG at them.
Well, Longju wouldn't have gotten 3-0 in their quarterfinals.
Yeah, I think Longju wins then, mate, because SK Telecom could have lost to everyone in the playoffs.
Yeah.
They were pretty rocky that year, if you remember. Right, if we move to this year then, Deficio. This year has seen, reminds me of the season 6 that you were describing, where it was like there was G2 and they were really good, and then the rest was a bit of a mess, you know.
Yep.
Because obviously we've now had Fnatic reassert themselves, championship team, but it's now G2 that's the team that had to kind of like find the hard way to come through. And then we obviously ended up with a surprise Worlds team, because it wasn't Misfits coming back, it's Vitality that get to go this time. So give us some opening thoughts. What should we expect from Europe? Like, as a region, is it going to be a strong showing this time?
As a region, no. It's all about Fnatic right now.
Very top heavy.
It's not just based on the teams we're sending, but also based on the group draw. Right there, I think a peak G2 will obviously win play-ins and then probably be able to do something. I believe they can get into Group A or Group C, and both those groups there's definitely a chance a great G2 can do something. But I don't believe we're gonna get that. I think we're recording this now here on a Tuesday, and play-ins has already started, and G2 they're currently 1-1, looking extremely shaky in both games. And that's kind of the thing for me is Europe has become extremely top heavy, as you said, Loco. Fnatic have become the clear-cut best team in so many different metrics. The main reason they have the 2 best carries in the region, and when you have the 2 best carries in the region, you can make as many mistakes as you want. Often you can honestly cheat your way through certain games or certain metas, and you can just rely on those 2 guys in vast majority of the cases to just win you games. And Caps and Reckless, in Spring Split it was the Reckless show. as the main carry, but Caps honestly had an insane split and was probably more important than Reckless ended up being, just because Caps even alone would win lanes like 1v2, 1v3. He learned to play around jungle pressure. He learned to play more with Broxa. He definitely learned more about how to be a split pusher. All these things, we had Reckless on our podcast, the Euphoria podcast, saying that in 2017, Caps didn't know how to split push. He didn't know what to do on the map. But he learned that in 2018, which is also why we didn't get the Reckless Kennen, who had to sit in side lanes and be a split pusher, because they didn't have to anymore. They could actually play traditional comps. So Fnatic, in a lot of ways, just became the best team. And if they wanted to play early game, they could draft for early game and they could beat you in the early game. If they wanted to play late game, they could just draft for late game. And as long as they weren't, down. Actually, as long as the Nexus hadn't died at 25 minutes, Reckless would be on 3 items in Spring and he would just win you the team fight. So you had this Fnatic team that basically seemed unbeatable in best of fives in Europe in Spring. G2 had lost Sven and Mithi. Thank you, TSM. Obviously, for taking them away. Trick had returned to Korea. Expect had also. I actually don't know what Expect is doing right now, but he's a free agent, I guess.
And joined one of the teams, I think, as like who did they join? Because there was some team got all the top laners, and he joined as like another one.
Oh yeah, he's Fnatic's
like backup or something.
Sub or something. Yeah, he's Fnatic's emergency sub right now. That's true. So I guess he's Fnatic's emergency sub at the moment. But G2 completely rebuilt. Only perks remained. Instead, it's Wonder, Jankos, obviously big names in Europe, names who'd already shown they're great players, and then Jan and Radid came over from Rocket, and that was kind of the big question mark regarding the new G2 lineup, because they were not regarded as one of the best bot lanes in Europe ever, and generally Jan has never actually been regarded as like a true Sven Reckless style carry. Like, he's not the guy you just put on a late game champ and say, let's go to team fights and we will win every time. And that's actually been a big issue for G2, because it's been less about Perks and Jankos playing together than I expected when I saw this lineup. And it's actually been more about trying to play a lot of different styles. Sometimes they try to play the bot side. Sometimes they try to play carry tops with Wonder. The bot side styles never really worked in Spring for them, and it just became, we need a carry top laner for Wonder, we need Jankos to play around top side, and we need Perks to just always do well in his lane 1v1, and then he can go top as well for Wonder. And that kind of became the G2 style in Spring that they ended up making the final with, but in the final, Fnatic could match it. And as long as Fnatic didn't fall too far behind in the early game, which they didn't, they only fell behind like a couple of thousand golds, they would just win every team fight. Because G2, and that is still the case now, are not a good late game team. They've gone completely against everything G2 used to be famous for, which was macro and late game. And they have to 100% now rely on solo laners winning, which is not what they want to do. They want to be a standard team. They want to be, the classic, we can play every style, we can play late game, we can play early game, but that's just not the case. And we saw that today in play-ins already. We've seen that in the EU LCS, where in Summer Split, G2 were not even close to being the best team after Funnel got nerfed. Because they obviously were super good at playing Funnel at first.
Yes.
They were 6-0, best team in Europe going into Rift Rivals. All that stuff, Funnel gets nerfed. They have terrible weeks after that. Jankos, if he's not on Talir, ends up just hard feeding every game. Wonder is trying to play all kinds of different stuff up top lane, and it doesn't really work. The bot lane has issues because they're not playing mages anymore. They end up just relying purely on a few specific picks, like the Talir jungle in the regular season, like the Tam Kench support. And it also made them, to me, not really a huge contender in playoffs. And obviously they got knocked out pretty quickly. We even heard from the team after they'd lost every scrim for a week leading up to the quarterfinal game they play against Misfits, and they get 3-0, just ran over completely. So when I look at this Worlds lineup, I look at a G2 team in play-ins with a lot of issues, and I look at a team who, when Wonder and Perks are getting ahead on carry champs, can look really good because they're actually good at playing 1-3-1. They're really good at playing split push. But the problem is they try to still draft for team fights, they try and draft scaling like they did today against Supermassive. And when they play that style, it kind of their fairly weak team macro can get exposed. And Yanen and Vadid as a bottom lane will not win you a lot of games on traditional AD carries or like scaling AD carries. So I think this G2 lineup, when they get to play 1-3-1 split push with Wonder and Perks, and when Jankos has a good early game, I think they're scary. Because Perks is a great player, he's a very smart player, and Wonder is also a guy who really understands how to play split push. It's good. They also just need Tam Kench if they can get it, because then they put Wadid in mid lane and he can Tam Kench all to side lanes and it's really hard to stop. But when they don't get the 1-3-1 style, I think the team is not that strong. And that's why I have a lot of concerns for G2. But I can see them in groups if they get like a Team Liquid group.
Sure.
I can actually see them abuse top side of the map really hard. And as long as Nyan and Wadid can get a really safe bot lane where they don't fall too far behind against double lift, I can see G2 win that matchup. Because Perks is also a better mid laner than Pope Builder. But it obviously requires them to get out of planes at this point, and we don't even know what's going to happen. After they lost one game, they might become a second seed. So there's a lot of question marks there.
I think
there you go. What should we expect from Vitality? Any shot of them getting out of their group? And a little bit about Vitality. I only know Jizuke and I know Gilius got benched. That's like the main things I know about Vitality, right. But obviously you're the expert.
So Vitality has been in Europe for many years now. It's a French organization. Tried a lot in the past to pick up really big names and like build these quote-unquote super teams. They found success one split where they had like Nukta, Caposhot, Kasing, Yanen, like these kind of players who had all done a lot in Europe, but they got knocked out of playoffs, and then they actually never returned to playoffs until this year, where they changed the strategy. They went away from famous names. You will obviously probably notice they had a Chani as well last year, who came over, and it was a mess.
He just entered, yeah.
Dude, he was just hard entered every game. Yeah. It was a huge mess. So this year, Vitality completely changed the strategy and said, we don't want big veteran names. We actually want to take a chance on new names. So Giants qualified at the start of 2018 with Jizuke on the lineup, with Gilius on the lineup, with Mini Trupax, who's now Attila, the AD carry. Jack Troll was the support, and then they had Ruin, the AD carry, or the top laner. And Vitality effectively just picked up everything except for Ruin. They
poor guy.
Yeah, I know, but they kept Caposhot as kind of the veteran, and then they got Jizuke, Attila, and Jack Troll, who are all three rookies, and then Gilius, of course, which came in as kind of the second veteran, I guess, next to Caposhot in this case here. And they won. They're playing fast. They're playing like really fast early games. In Spring Split, everything was built around Jizuke. Jizuke was on a carry that could snowball and split push. Gilius would gank mid lane. Jack Troll would roam mid lane. And the moment Jizuke got ahead, he would go to a side lane and he would just like try and 1v3, 1v5 everything. There's really like if you go Jizuke montages, like you're gonna get him like 1v2ing Fnatic
the Rise
on
play.
Rise,
yeah.
Exactly. You're gonna get his like echo games, and like the guy is insane when he got to play split push when he was ahead. So that was like Spring Split Vitality. They ended up becoming actually a pretty strong team, and they got 4th place in total. They lost the 3rd place match against Splice, mainly because the team never learned to play late game. Really poor Baron setups. It was a huge issue. It was a big meme about Gilius getting outsmited. Not very strong in team fights. So generally it was like win early game through mid, play super aggressive around Jizuke in a side lane, and then try and run over the enemy team. And if you could get a team fight around like 25 minutes and win that fight, that would then be your window to take Baron and close out the game. And that happened in a lot of the games for them, but then in playoffs, teams like Fnatic could match the early game, and Splice could stall out in most of the games and then punish Vitality in the late game. So that was spring. Summer, they bench Gilius a couple of like week 4 or 5. They bench Gilius. Clearly, it doesn't work between him and the team. They pick up Kikis, who's been in the scene since 2010. Actually, was part of like WCG as well back then.
It's his third time kicking Gilius off the team, I think, right?
Yeah, he's done this multiple times. He on the original Unicorns, they qualified. They had Gilius as a jungler, but then they kicked him and they got Kikis instead, just to go all the way back to 2015. Kikis joins. He's been a top laner for G2. That was the last time we saw him in the LCS. He's then played jungle for Illuminar Gaming, and they play the EU Masters, which is the national league tournament we have in Europe. And they make the final, and they play against Origen, who's picked up Froggen and all these kind of guys. And Kikis, first half of that tournament, hard ends every game, and second half actually plays really well. But he has one play style, which is go ham. So when he gets picked up by Vitality get a playstyle again, because they kind of lost their identity. It was no longer about split pushers anymore. Jizuke didn't play very well. They tried to play a lot of mages in the bot lane, which was okay, but it only worked for like a week or two. So they kind of lost their playstyle and identity completely, and they weren't. I actually, at that point when week 4, I thought they were not going to make playoffs. I'm like, this team is actually going to drop out. But with Kikis, they go 11-1. They win every game. They only lose to Schalke. That's the only game they lose. But then they beat Schalke in the tiebreaker game that puts Vitality in second place after regular season. And the playstyle is very simple. It is pushing mid laners with strong jungle picks, and it's pushing bot lanes. So they are red side team. They want to counterpick jungle, and they want to counterpick bot lane. So they win those two specific matchups. Jizuke has been playing a ton of like Galio and that kind of stuff where he can like push and then he can join with ulti on a potential skirmish. And Kikis is living in your jungle. Like that's his favorite playstyle. He wants to just like shut down the jungler, get full control of one side, ideally the bot side, and then you can make a play happen if you have their winning bottom lane. They try sometimes to play top lane, which has been okay, but it's not been, to me, a very successful style. But they like to do it, but I don't think it's the best way for them to win. So Cabochard is just kind of the rock, like the one consistent guy. And the other 4 players, crazy in the head. Like, you can see fantastic compositions with new picks you didn't expect. You're going to see super, super aggro games, which is actually why if there's any team we had to put into this group, I'm happy it's Vitality.
So you think they have a shot against Gen.G,
yes,
and Royal never gives up?
They will not make it out of groups, but they will not make the games easy for RNG and Gen.G whatsoever. Especially because I think RNG and Gen.G actually prefer slower games. Like they don't feel like they have to fight the first 15 minutes. RNG can get sucked into it very easily, even with scaling comps. So I actually, the way I predict it right now is the 4 games we're going to have, so 2 games against RNG, 2 games against Gen.G. I think we're going to have 2 games where Vitality will fail the early game. Like they will get counter ganged or whatever happens, and they're just going to get stomped. We're also going to get 2 games out of those 4 where Vitality will win the early game, where Vitality will actually get up a couple of thousand gold, but then they have to finish the game, and they will probably not be able to do that because they will never win team fights against these teams ever. But I'm telling you, they're confident, they're trash talkers, they prepare interesting picks. They are a nightmare in a best of 1.
Okay.
And it's not often we have teams who I consider really good best of 1 teams in Europe. Like for Worlds, we tend to send like the better late game teams in the past. But I think Vitality can actually give us some really good games, but they will not get out of groups.
Oh, I'm really excited because I didn't know anything about Vitality other than K and Gilius getting kicked, and I thought, they just squeezed in and they beat Schalke, but it seems like they have an identity, and I'm super hyped to watch them.
Yeah, and I mean, the last thing to add in, while Jizuke had a pretty rough summer split compared to spring, he kind of got his revenge in the 3rd place game where they played against Misfits, and instead of him playing utility like push and roam mid laners, he went back to playing pure carries, and he's especially famous for Rise, which is kind of his main pick. And he got to play that against Misfits. He carried with it. He cries after because he was so bad. in the spring playoffs against Splice, but then he gets his revenge now, and like it's an amazing team to follow, honestly. And if you ever get the chance to chat to Jisuke, you should.
Okay.
He's the first Italian pro gamer.
Italian Stallion, that was his nickname,
Italian
right?
Stallion, yeah, definitely.
All right. So moving on to
they're gonna be great. Oh,
moving on to other questions. One question I have to ask you: is Fnatic better than Team Liquid? Is Fnatic the best Western team going to Worlds?
Yes.
Explain. Explain.
So, Fnatic brings something we don't see from Western teams very often, which is, first of all, they bring what I call the ideal setup, for me at least, which is double carry, triple support. Western teams, when they've tried to play triple carry lineups, where it's like you have a carry top laner, you have a carry mid laner, and you have like a strong AD carry, and they all three demand resources, Western teams fail. It requires way too much coordination, and it requires people to sacrifice themselves, which they will fail to do, and they will not understand what to do. And I'm actually going to use TSM as an example here of that very quickly. To me, Hauntzer is not like a utility top laner. He's not a supportive top laner. He actually wants to be more of a carry. Then you have Bjergsen in the mid lane, and in this case you have now Sven in the bottom lane. So you end up having 3 lanes that ideally in a perfect world you can all try and play around, and you can all try and utilize as carries. And that often means when Hauntzer is on a tank, I see him getting caught out 24/7. I see him struggle to understand where to be on the map. And that is something that really hurts the rest of the team. And you can then also argue that Sven and Bjergsen are passive or more passive minded
than other carries.
Than other carries, right? So if you contrast that to Fnatic, when Fnatic plays SOAS, they have a supportive utility top laner. They have Broxah, who's always going to be focused on just playing for lanes. He never plays for himself. He only plays for lanes. And then you have Hylissang, who's obviously very focused on trying to get caps ahead.
Oh, wait. Then I have to ask you. SOAS is infamous for saying, I will never play dog champs. This is a dog champ play.
That's gone. This is a new SOAS.
No. Okay. He just complains and then does it anyway.
Okay.
That's the thing. It's just complaining, mate.
I actually think SOAS has had his best year in many, many years. And it's kind of insane when you consider how long he's been playing. But he's individually done a lot better. In Europe, he will never lose lane. A lot of the dumb deaths he used to have are kind of gone. The famous SOAS is getting caught in a side lane. It has not happened very often in Europe. And when he plays, you can see that Fnatic are a little bit more calm in what they're doing, and he is one of the big voices who can obviously kind of dictate what's going to happen with the team. Okay. Because the entire goal for Fnatic now, and the reason I think they are better than Team Liquid, is, first of all, I think the Reckless versus Doublelift
has to go to double.
I mean, right now it goes to Doublelift. I agree with you. But I don't think the difference is that huge. I don't think
Pobelter caps is, in your opinion.
Exactly.
Okay.
But Pobelter caps is.
I'll give you that.
Caps any mid lane in North America is huge.
Caps is the best Western player at the tournament. I can give you that 100%.
I actually think that he's mechanically the best Western player we've ever had. But it's too early to call him the greatest of all time because he's only played for 2 years. But to me, because now they have caps, and because they have an AD carry in Reckless, who's not, I actually think Reckless, he's not at the same level as the best AD carries at this tournament, but he's definitely a very good AD carry you're bringing to the table. He's not a weak link per se. But then you have Caps, who's just such a level above every other Western mid laner right now, mechanically, that it really pulls Fnatic ahead. The team has learned how to play around Caps. They've learned, if you go to Caps' lane with early ganks from your support, from your jungler, roams from top lane, you're going to get this guy ahead. And when he's ahead now, he's so good at just snowballing his own advantage. Caps is the reason Fnatic ends up winning this split. Like, Reckless was gone for half the split. They played Whippo bot lane. Caps in the final, in the semi-final, when Fnatic are actually doing something I hate. They're picking scaling drafts and then they're playing for early game, which to me can be the downfall of Fnatic, but they tried to do that against Misfits. They fell behind. Caps alone keeps them in these games. Okay. And they have that X factor that I don't see from Western teams a lot overall. Because what we tend to do is we tend to look at a player and say, this guy is amazing in his region, therefore he's going to be the main win condition at Worlds, and then that player ends up just being, at the same level or slightly below the best in the world at that. That can be Fnatic last year with Reckless, right? Fnatic at MSI, when they played around Reckless this year, he plays against Uzi. Well, I mean, Uzi's going to be better, right? That win condition is gone. But Caps has shown at MSI already, where he was in the group stages, the best performing mid laner with Mabel. He's shown that he can beat most of the other international mid laners, and especially if you play to his lane. And when I look at the Fnatic's group, I see 100 Thieves, who I do not consider a good team.
Yeah, give you that.
And Ryu will not be able to do anything against Caps. Actually, none of the lanes will really be able to do anything that I'm scared of, at least as a Fnatic fan. And then I see IG. And
the actual best mid laner in the tournament.
Dude, that's where you have Rookie, who's the best mid laner in the world right now. And him versus Caps, because Caps, I believe he's so good, I think the main win condition of IG so far has been, super good split push with solo laners winning, especially Rookie. I think Caps and Fnatic will be able to actually nullify that advantage. And that's why I think Fnatic can get first in this group and actually make it out as a first seed.
Okay, leading into the second question. Rookie and Caps both play super risky, super aggressive. When they go against each other, it's not going to be one person gets a kill. One person's going to blow the other person out of the water. And Rookie's better than Caps. You think Caps can... I will say Caps' Broxah synergy has been really insane. So
see, there you go. That's the thing. It's not about 1v1 for Fnatic anymore. It's not Caps alone. It's these guys. They're like Youngbuck is a really smart level 1 coach, and they always abuse teams level 1 to get like a small lane advantage or small jungle advantage. Fnatic also as a team have actually kind of learned now that you don't need to necessarily play around top and bot lane if you're against someone like Rookie. So I think Fnatic will be smart enough to not play 1v1 mid, because you don't have to. Use your jungle, use your roams from support. Like I'm predicting Hillsang to pick like a support that can actually be proactive in the early levels with going towards mid lane. And the thing about the matchup, I actually think it's going to be 1-1, IG versus Fnatic, because I kind of hinted to this before, but to me, what could be the downfall of Fnatic is the fact that I feel like in Europe, they have not been pushed enough because they've always been able to fall back on having the best carries and playing some of the best.
It's reminiscent of when TSM was super dominant in Season 6. It's like they just won so hard. It's like they never actually were in bad situations till they went to Worlds,
Yeah,
because
this year...
That's the thing.
This year for both Team Liquid and Fnatic, they weren't challenged at all in NA or Europe. So I'm actually really afraid for both teams, and I hope they get a lot out of boot camp, because both teams just breathe through summer and spring.
But that's what my hope is, that because they haven't been, punished that hard, that there's still a lot they actually can learn from a boot camp. Like they haven't peaked by any means. That they're not sitting at the maximum capacity here. And Fnatic and TL went to boot camp instantly. Like they won a split, boom, they left. They just started practicing. And that's kind of thing with Fnatic. In the semifinal against Misfits, as I said before, we saw a Fnatic team when they are at their worst, which is when they're practically just ignoring what the comp is supposed to do. Like they drafted Vayne mid lane and a bunch of other scaling champions. And if you hear Vayne mid lane, you probably don't think to yourself, oh, okay, they want to fight everything in the early game. Like
no, they want to kill tanks later. You have the strongest backline if by running Vayne plus AD. Yeah.
That game had non-stop action. Caps at level 4 tried to like jump in and kill the enemy Olaf, and then he ends up dying and he falls behind, loses both summons, and kills his own jungler with him. And like calls like that can happen because this Fnatic team, they're still, when they are not super focused, they can just, they play too much almost then through Caps' mind, which is I need to fight all the time, like Rookie. And Misfits in that series actually ended up being 1-1 in that Vayne game was game 3, and Misfits were actually really far ahead in that game, and probably should have been able to close out the game and be up 2-1 in the series, because Fnatic kept drafting scaling and kept fighting them 24/7 in the early game. But then Caps made that big play on Hansama where he like knocks the Tristana into the wall.
Vayne condemn, I
kills
saw
him, and then he wins the next team fight because he's a fed Vayne now, and that's it. But that's, to me, that was the bad Fnatic. That's the Fnatic that only won because they had some individual players that were better than the rest, and not because they were the smarter team or the greater team, And I think against IG, you're not going to have the same individual advantage as you've had against a lot of European teams. So that's where Fnatic needs to show me the smart Fnatic that I know we can see. The team we did see in the final against Schalke, who punished like Schalke's 1-3-1 setups, the team who understood exactly how to actually play out the late game with their comp, because I think they're a better late game team than IG, but they're not a better early game team. And if they pick something where they fight too much early, they can lose for sure.
So one last question I have to ask you is regarding European mid laners and like why Europe has consistently produced such good mid laners like over the years, and how Europe can survive getting NA heavily importing from Europe, not just mid lane, other lanes too, and also European players dying out. I guess it's a two-part question. Why does Europe constantly come up with such great mid laners over and over and over again? And also, how the hell is Europe surviving all these bright stars like flaming out and players getting imported to NA?
First of all, we have a very large player base in Europe, which definitely helps. We've always had extremely competitive, but also fairly toxic solo queue, where what you basically get judged on is not how nice you are, but it's how good mechanically you are, especially as a mid laner. So, seeing as we very early on had some players that ended up being like super good at playing, especially assassins, it's always kind of been a big deal in European solo queue that mid laners could play some of these things, and a lot of mid laners have been discovered because they like popped off on Yasuo or Zed or these kind of champions early on. Riven, Riven is another good example of that. So I think we've always had a huge ego thing in the mid lane, where it's like, if I'm going to be one of the best mid laners, I need to be mechanically insane. I need to be able to play assassins at the highest level, and whenever I play against a guy who's already a pro player, and I'm a 16-year-old kid from Holland or whatever, I'm gonna pick Riven. I'm gonna style on this guy. My name is Febiven, and now people are gonna see me. And that's kind of always for me when I've seen European mids appear. It's always kind of been around that style. We've had very few mid laners who were famous for their control style, except for like Froggen. So he's almost more of an outlier in that case, but so many other mid laners go up through the ranks because they're mechanically super good. And I think just the environment in solo queue is very competitive for at least getting to like a pro level. I don't think the environment is good enough to say that you can then actually continue to improve mechanically compared to, let's say, Korean solo queue. So I think just the step from semi-pro to full-time pro, European solo queue is good enough. And then I think also now in modern day, we are really lucky that we have national leagues, which means we actually have a bunch of leagues like the Spanish National League, the French National League, where we have professional or at least close to professional teams with coaching staffers, gaming houses. Actually, they are professional teams, right? Gaming houses, coaching staffs, everything that scout for these young players, that pick them up very early and teach them how to play on a professional team, and then they get to play against other up-and-coming players and sometimes former LCS players in these national leagues. They don't just get stuck on a team that you can't trust or whatever that makes roster changes 24/7, because they have very similar setups to LCS teams. And that's just a lot of credit to the size of Europe, and it's actually finally an advantage with having a very split
and
region,
a
divided region, where the Spanish league in itself, like the Spanish people, they're proud, man, they're passionate, and if they watch other Spanish teams play, they love it. So there's interest to create a Spanish league, and it can actually function. I don't think a lot of other regions necessarily can do that. And it's now allowed us to have like a very clear path of solo queue, National League LCS, which will further really promote a lot of growth. So yeah, large player base, a solo queue that is toxic, but very focused around mechanics and individual like outplays. And then the National League system now, which gives a very clear path to pro, means that we're going to keep producing, man. Like every year I think to myself, we're not going to have that many new great players now. We're just going to have the same old ones, which is fine. But then like Vitality show up with Jizuke and these guys, and Jizuke in that spring split is like fantastic, and there's so many cool things. Caps shows up out of nowhere basically. Like this will keep happening.
Okay. I mean, I guess you answered all the questions at once.
I mean, I tried at least to make it shorter. But there's going to be more players. I guarantee you already next year, there's going to be a bunch of new guys you've never heard about, and they're just going to be super fun to watch.
Okay. With franchising coming up, I'm really excited for Europe next year. I'll definitely pay more attention to those.
You should watch EU LCS, man.
I try to watch finals. It's impossible. There's so many games played. I watch NA, Korea, and then to watch another league that, it's near impossible.
That's true. That is fair. It's actually, there's almost too much League of Legends going on.
Yeah. Sometimes less is more.
Maybe. Anyway, go Fnatic.
But not when it comes to our Worlds coverage, which will continue with future episodes addressing the different regions, and we've got some other things planned that aren't just setups and previews, but we'll give you a surprise for those. So we'll just leave it at that.